So this one has an owl,
Okay.
which is very cool because it pans the whole room, it pans everything.
Okay.
And it picks up voices really easily way in the back.
Okay.
It's very cool technology.
Yeah. Yeah. That's not bad about somebody.
Same thing as someone back there is going. There. So you're sharing, and so I'll hang out down here for a while. I got to stop.
Okay. So that's no worries.
College is like living at the fields. And we got the Farm and Ranch show in February. And right after the bee college, we got the Sportsman's Expo, which yeah, it's an horticulture.
I don't know.
Yeah, and then it's just crazy.
I'm gonna check to make sure somebody's video with me.
Okay.
You booked a sunny Urbo ski chalet with endless views of snow-covered peaks.
That'll work. So then, I guess my only thing is I want to make sure that
It's still sharing, so we have to do it.
okay. All right.
And then.
Mhm.
I almost wish I had two screens upstairs. So that would be kind of. I'll do this.
Okay.
Because this is your only program, right?
Yep.
And then besides your. And I haven't figured out how to make this go along with this, so that it's all this.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's something to do with how I grab it and share it. I can't do this one.
Well, I might give away some of my.
How do you feel? Oh, my brother. Boy. And I feel like these years, and you're really thought about it. We're gonna be doing programs on the smart board, so maybe those two like should turn off. Well, you know, you didn't know what they're natural. And I did have everyone try to remember.
Okay. Well, I have some stuff. I have
You're not the one with the cat.
a couple
Oh,
samples and then
okay. There's a lady that looks similar to
one for my garden.
Oh.
See, I don't know anybody went out there.
And I have some.
I know. Our guns were no combo.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And then where
Amen.
should we make it? Is that all right to do that? paper towel, so,
Yeah, let me see what I can find upstairs.
okay. Do you want me to call you?
Oh, she has something.
Okay,
Yeah, boy.
yes. Thanks, Kevin.
Nice shirt. Nice shirt.
What?
Nice shirt.
Oh, thank you. I don't hear out of this ear, so people think I'm rude sometimes, but. I love plaid.
Yeah, me too. Obviously.
Ready for some exciting times tonight?
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
The
You got a handful.
horse.
Thank you.
Yeah, should have-
Oh, yeah. Or maybe the teacher.
Oh, well, sure, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like that, huh?
Yeah.
Well, I'll see.
That's obviously, yeah. They said they're gonna have to do it one day, the introduction one, yeah. Is that the herbalist or the what's on the stuff? 'Cause I went to a class with the laboratories.
Oh,
Class. I was like, oh, that's pretty good.
and out.
I did, and I had the herbalist make some of the tea they recommended as well. So I feel like it's helping already. Did you get that meal?
It's a little spicy.
Yeah, it smells good.
Yeah, it's nice. Yeah. I felt real bad for them when I was out there carrying. Because they didn't. Oh, okay. Well,
You going?
good.
Good.
Uh-huh. You got it, huh? No, I didn't. Huh? What? You got what? Oh, I got these in the front row. Oh, right. I can't. Oh, I'll join you over here then. to let you know, I got here late late being cut off, and almost the whole classroom was filled when I got here. There was like 10 hours. Huh? Yeah.
I'm gonna ask you a question I didn't get answered last
No,
week.
it's like
so long.
30 minutes early is a really long time.
Okay.
And it really applies to start
Okay.
I just
Right in the
don't want to
forecast.
go back because I won't care.
I get distracted when I was doing stuff, so I do better.
You hold on to that question. We'll answer that.
Okay.
Okay.
Sure.
We'll talk about that.
Oh, I never was. I was always.
And I go, luckily I have a dog that likes to dig all my container gardens with my food and that.
You didn't find any old choo-choos over there, did you? Mine used
Yeah,
to
weird
bury
dogs.
old.
They don't understand the nature of a chew toy.
Okay.
They go, we had a visiting friend who brought their husky, and she was into the toys, but she was like playing with them, and they're like playing keep away, and they were like, we don't get it.
So mine used to bury rawhides.
Oh,
And I would find them 8 months later, a year later, and they, they were really gross, yeah, but they buried them in the dirt. That's pretty awful.
My dogs don't understand the concept of toys.
Glad you made it.
Edible or not
Yeah.
edible.
Yeah.
You.
Well, I did bring
Yeah, you
pictures
wanna
of
grab
the
one of
kitties
each
and
of those
stuff.
handouts?
Oh, good. Yes, or last Wednesday, but then I did not bring my laptop today, so I don't have them. Well, we'll see before.
We have plenty of time.
Yeah, the laptop, even though
I like
it's late, it's
the kids
still.
you have.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great, yeah. Glad you enjoyed those.
Huh?
Glad you enjoyed those.
Yeah.
Well, I went to look, to
Yeah.
download this electric today, and the only one that I'm able to get to download from the master, or from the extension site is the vegetable one. I think it's my site is already good. I'm going on the county extension site. What do I say?
Okay.
Laramie County Extension. But at the moment, I think what my computer's doing is I think it's remembering the memory instead of uploading to the right
Okay.
file. And so right now, it's not very useful. Oh, my.
And it won't, no pressure. Like all the numbers in it, it will work.
The more I learn, the more I
Oh,
learn.
they're not thinking, they're just not.
Oh,
Ice fishing.
well, like I said, I'm not, it's not been real successful today. I thought I'd go ahead and see if I could download this lecture or something, and I couldn't get anything. This lecture was not in there, so.
That was a lot. I watched it.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like, I mean, there's so much experience.
I feel like. Oh, I don't know. But I will tell you one thing that's cool is our church got $1,000 grant to buy some trees, so that like a donated grant, a donated amount. And we were talking about what can we do, and I thought, well, the first thing I thought about is putting together the wind and the sun and everything, and so now I can do that.
No, I can just.
Yeah. And say this, I'm not quite that good yet. I still gotta put it over. Oh, okay. Well, I do feel like I'm already using some of this stuff.
Okay, so where do I go?
Go to do the little, they call that a hamburger, by the way, that's for my husband. Egg and pork. Okay, and now see your first. Oh, there it goes. Okay.
Oops, sorry.
Egg and pork. And now. scroll down. Look for master, master. Oh, there we go. Okay.
Now, just for the heck of it, so all these. That doesn't look. No, it's not. It's not responding real fast. It's not opening. Yeah, that's where you go though. Oh, there it is. It's at the bottom. So that's the one that keeps coming up all the time. So click on this one. Just for the heck of it. Just a second. Is it loading? Yeah. Okay, so you got what you're supposed to get. I kept getting the vegetable order every time. Just 100%, but there's a lot in there that's like that. Oh, see, this is good, yeah. Yeah. Because when I got. I found it, I took it out. Oh, okay, yeah. I don't have a desk. Oh, yeah, yeah, so there's a lot.
Some days that's all you can see, right?
Probably not everything, but.
We started out the day with the frozen furnace and now we don't have that, so things are improving.
Oh, no, it wasn't burning.
Things are lifting up, I know, I didn't wanna, so we better get them taken care of.
Oh, yeah. And you put it on TV? I kept getting, mine kept doing is going back to the memory, to the first one that I clicked on. So there's something like that. I'm gonna erase the history and then try again. Or I'll call my husband and say, honey, how do you do this? Because she went through this. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And we are, oh, that's the end, so. It's all right. So, I know. I know, it's takes a while, but.
Sure.
Yeah. I can do that. Hi, Kim. Long time no see. We were at the conference together Saturday, so. It was the Habitat Hero. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. I feel like I've been studying and sitting for days already. I need to get out and do physical activity. We don't have a garden, so we used to have a garden, but there's too many people that are older, and I have a lot of work to do at home. Because I have a lot of, a decent sized property that's inside now. And so I just kind of gave up on garden. But the trees, I've got tons of, I work with learning how to, I will have trouble with that. I've already got 20 hours.
Yeah, there's
so far.
something.
That's how I started. Yeah, I started a little sheet and I put some time and a number of hours and then I put, so I'm just kind of keeping that. Oh, yeah, I can just turn it off. Yeah. Oh, okay. That would be great. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I don't know how it's.
I know, that's why I can't find what I'm talking about.
Someone has a list that there's a whole system. Because she called my son. Last year.
One of my first meetings I just happened to have a catalog and I wanted to pass it on. My daughter was here last year.
So most of you.
Yeah, I didn't see a sign. I've only signed twice. Apparently, so I don't want to. Yeah, apparently there has been a sign and sheet several times. So. But I've only.
I never tried to make it.
I don't think it's.
Something like this.
Right.
Nice. So I was hoping I'd find somebody who
Okay,
did
okay.
something that asked about it afterwards, so they can
Well, our little town puppies that I told you
So what's
about.
your interest in all these?
Lisa just.
I probably have the first yard.
Oh, okay.
Well,
It's about a
everything.
year and a half.
What's sad is
He's looking at.
the house was
The column.
1979.
It's really good.
It's all brand new.
Looks up at the nose.
I'm trying to.
The house, she's fussy. She
Oh,
doesn't
Probably
really
make sure I'm.
And so I finally looked on her corner for her and looked at those canines and it's like, oh my gosh. So she's scheduled for next week.
Your system, but it was just a disaster. They said it was,
Okay, they're terrible.
so it was really- Although I just got a notice that there comes through the fiber optic. But they're not doing anything at all. So I have to wait until I see what they're doing. They just reach out to the backyard.
Oh, I know her. Yeah, I used to go to her. She is wonderful.
No. I'm gonna go out the door.
You've ever had a- Well, Kira, we used to go there. because we lived on that side of town, and now yeah, really expensive. She didn't charge me that much. I don't know. But she also got a partner. She used to I wasn't there, but she was. See, I would get with her.
You know.
The one thing I didn't like about Texas is for an older dog, she doesn't do and so you have to go to Colorado, which I didn't. I wanted a rental, the emergency clinic or something, or you have to find like another vet that you're not. Well, my friend. And then it could
Yeah, I started it. So. Yeah. That's okay.
Her dog got it. She called it. They probably, they might
How
have
big is
changed
your
now.
place?
I've got
Oh,
five
I'll
acres.
have to take a
Okay.
look, 'cause I like them, and that was
So
something
that's-
that.
That's what the property is.
See, I've taken
Okay.
Max,
That's the house.
Max one time.
So I put a window in there 20
We were like
years
on
ago.
Saturday afternoon. But we didn't want to go down to Fort Collins first.
So I've got a.
Yeah, and that's one thing about
County
Charlotte.
house
Because
down
they're
there.
24
For
They'll meet you
for
there.
Austrian kinds of-
Okay, I used to, and I like it.
Selecting-
Yeah, it's a big town. Yeah, I like it here.
Couple of fruit trees
And the
up
prices
here.
are pretty high.
Some
I mean, I
cherries,
think.
other fruit bushes over here.
Oh,
I've got
but
a garden down
not
here.
quite there yet. Okay. I love, yeah, 10%, anything. Well, we'll get this one done, because we're also gonna do each other.
Right, right. My father.
And I don't even just like this, I mean, they don't do it this.
Really?
So now we're gonna only do it, not have her under. Yeah, she's a personality, we'll get over.
Yeah, my father started in like January.
everybody's.
That's what they said. There's plenty of
Yeah.
dirt roads out there, dirt outside. Well, we had some.
How what? Oh, yeah. Kara, she has this thing, she parks at 6 in the morning sharp. We can set our.
West side.
She goes, she's got a closet. She goes to the basement, which is the lowest floor in our house, we're on the highest. And she parks at 6 o'clock. She's now, what she does that for, we don't know.
I know the name, it's been so many years since I've been there. Moved out.
The hundred, you can each have a different. Probably by the cat. But that's the problem, you know. There's a, this kid thinks of, well, in my last house, I had. He under the fence, well, not under the fence, we have a retaining wall. So she can't really go anywhere, but Dawn gets so frustrated and he can't stop her. I gotta go in there. Yeah. Yeah, Dawn keeps trying to fill the holes, but I'm like, don't bother.
We got. Very exciting. Yeah. First 5 years.
Well, I figure we'll just let her stay where she's staying, and then she is 12, so a couple more years.
Okay.
Oh, it does, and I think she's actually looking for mice and stuff. It's always under this retaining wall where I. Oh, yeah. I don't know, she's not big for these, but we do have the nested things.
And now you've heard me talking. about
Their
this last
personalities.
Great.
Yeah, I saw those canine teeth and I thought, oh. Yeah, it's just impossible, and I showed my husband, and I said, honey, we can't wait for 2 months, we gotta get this done now. So this So we used to get those bones that are boiled with
Goes in your pocket, and then up in the
well,
ground, and then the
she
tower.
liked them and she did well with them. She had a lot of fun. But then when she got older, she would get sick enough with them.
Yeah.
And she would, so we had to stop giving her dogs. You know, so now we don't have it actually. Yeah, you have a good nutrition.
Oh, yeah. Well, if you were in the city, I would. If you are in town, if you were in town, they own the water.
Oh, the Tailway. Yep, I know where that is. Okay. I need to get her a muzzle because I need to see stuff that she's today. My husband said she had. Oh, and she is in her mouth. You know, we don't know what to do, but she wants to sniff really bad. I'm sure it's not. Yeah. I don't know, I'll have to research what I. Well, the thing is.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to class. Tonight's class is on soils. And we've got some handouts back there for you. And tonight's instructor is Brian Sebade, and he is from Albany County Extension Office. So he's kind of my counterpart over there, but he also does a lot more agriculture and deals with the lawn and garden questions. So he's going to be our instructor tonight. And he's going to talk to you about everything from A to Z on soil. And then we're going to get our hands dirty. You're going to learn how to texture soil. And then I've got some samples one from my garden and one from the garden that's out here at LCCC. So you'll get to actually look at the soil and feel the soil. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Brian, and he's going to lead you on a fun and exciting trip to soil.
Yeah, everybody's been looking forward to soils, right? That's the class you saw on the schedule when everything started, and that's what you wanted to go for, right? You could care less about anything else, flowers, vegetables, anything else, right? Okay, perfect. So I work out of the extension office in Laramie. I cover the 5-county area of Harbin, Albany, Platte, Goshen, and Laramie counties. So this is part of my area. I do agriculture and horticulture education. So I do all sorts of things from house calls, going out places, calls that come in, doing different publications, different applied research. So every day is a little bit different, but that's a good thing. So I grew up in Lander and went to the University of Wyoming. After that, I went to Sundance and worked for Extension up there in the northeast corner. And then I've been in Laramie since the fall of 2015, right? You would know that, right? Yeah, you could help me out. So that's where I've been. But soils is always one of those things that's maybe not the most exciting, but there's a lot to it. Just like anything else in the world, there's a biology side, there's a chemistry side, there's a physics side to it. So covering it all would be really tough in one night, but we'll kind of just get into some of the basics, kind of get some of the things you need to know down. So that way, if you're out making calls or somebody calls you with a question, you're helping Catherine out with the project, you'll have a pretty good idea of what's going on with soils that are around you. So I think it's kind of fun. There are things about soils that maybe do get a little boring, but we'll try and keep it exciting and go from there. So tonight we're learning about soil, right? Not dirt. Dirt's what's on your shoes when you walked in, right? Okay, perfect. So that's the biggest thing. So, all right, well, we'll get started here. Can everybody see? Do we need to dim lights or anything? Okay, you can't see, you can't hear, something's wrong, you're gonna yell at me, right? Okay, that's important. So, okay, so there's lots of definitions of what soil is. One of which is not dirt, right? So there's lots of things that are there. This is one that's out there. There's lots of other definitions you may run into. But basically, it's just a physical medium, right? It's 3-dimensional. Sometimes when we look at a soil, we think of it as kind of in a 2-dimensional way, but it's kind of interesting how it's really a 3-dimensional thing. It's interesting how, we think about it lots of times from our perspective, how things just go straight down. There's lots of things that go in different directions once we're in soils, right? They go in all sorts of different directions. So it's one of those things that can be really complex once we start to look at it. So how do we get to a soil? How do we have the soil that's outside the building, along the interstate I drove on or past this evening? How do we get to those soils? Have you ever heard of the soil forming factors? Okay. Soil forming factors, things that make soil happen. So what are some things that maybe make things happen? Here's a good picture of along the Grays River in the Wyoming range. So what made those soils happen? How are they different? What are some things that are going on there? I like to use this as a good example of how we end up with different soils. Wind, yeah. So we can think about maybe the climate, right? So our climate, we have temperature, we have lots of wind. We have the big hollow where I live in Laramie. I always keep thinking the wind's going to stop blowing, but I have a really large basin that's been blown out by wind. It's probably not a good chance of that, right? So we can have climate that affects it. Okay, what else?
Your rocks, basically.
Okay, so we have to have something we start with, right? So we might call that our parent material. Very good. What are some other things? Water, yep. So we can have erosion and other things that happen like that. What that?
Alluvial soils.
Yep, so we can have stuff that gets deposited from different places. So what would make things deposit in places? We can have water, but what else? Animals. What about here in Wyoming? What do we have? Tend to have mountains, right? So we think about topography. Okay, so we might think about topography from things not being able to stay in places, but we can also think about topography as far as what aspect that might be, right? So maybe it's on the north side of a hill, maybe it's on the south side of a hill, right? So we know we have fairly intense sunshine, we have different things happening with that as well.
Semi-arid situations with moisture.
We are, so we're fairly dry, right? So we're gonna be a lot different than Georgia, Hawaii, some places like that for sure. So how we have our soils is gonna be different for sure. So we think about Georgia, they have the red clay soils, right? And every summer I get questions about, I've got this red clay soil in my backyard in Laramie. And I say, no, it's red sandy soil, but we can go do some hand texturing and figure out why that's the way it is. So what about some of the other things? What about some of the living and non-living things, right? So if we think about the vegetation that we might have, right? So if we have a forested area, sometimes we might have a lot of acidic leaching that might happen. You know, different types of plants are going to do different things to the soil. If we think about some invasive plants, salt cedar, for example, it's a really interesting plant because it affects soil by bringing salts deep out from underneath, way down in our soil horizons, putting them up on the soil surface so it can provide a better habitat for itself and outcompete a lot of the native plants. So plants can have a fairly big effect on things as well. So I think we've about covered everything, right? Okay, so we have time, parent material, okay, the living things, our climate, topography, all those sorts of things affect why we have different types of soil. So we're going to look at a couple different examples. And you just blurred out why things might be different than the previous photo, what's happening. I just want us to kind of think about this stuff because lots of times if we're going on a house call as master gardeners, we're kind of having to think through these things, right? When somebody says, well, why is my tree dead? Why is this not growing? You're having to ask questions, you know, how often are you watering? You know, I do the same thing as I'm going out trying to figure out, well, what is your soil type? You know, how often should you be watering? All those sorts of things. So I like to put these different scenarios up there so we can kind of prompt ourselves for what we might be looking at. So what's different about this one? This is also from Wyoming. That's Continental Glacier in the background there.
Close to the parent material.
Very close to parent material, right? So we have to look at that as far as time. It hasn't been going on for very long, right? We have, let's see. My mouse show up on here? It does. It's white, but it's hard to see, right? So we have new parent material that's being dug up presently, right? Each year there's something new that's being dug up. We're probably having particles made that are more silty, right? So we have something that's maybe very young, even though it might be very old for what we're thinking about, but from a soil standpoint, this is very young, right? It's just starting out. What about plant life? There's black thereof, right? So we're in a climate where there's probably not a whole lot growing most of the year. And what does is very short. There's not a lot of production, right? So you aren't getting a bunch of above ground biomass like you would out in a hayfield in Laramie County, right? It's very short. We don't have a lot of things that are dying on top of the soil surface getting incorporated in. So we have a lot of things that are different than that first one, right? Very steep. We probably have some spots there where things are, you know, through topography being deposited in other places that we can't see, but this is very different from what we had, right? So then we've got a soil profile from along the Platte River over by Saratoga. And then this is at the rest area of Pine Bluffs. So what's different about those? Why are those different? Do you think if I dug a profile, they call it profile when you dig down and you can see the different layers of soil. We're going to get into what those are called in a little bit, but do you think that would differ for the Pine Bluff site compared to that one that we have at Saratoga? This is right along the Platte there. So Little bit different area, right? You know, not a huge difference in elevation, maybe. You know, probably a little bit cooler there at Saratoga than at Pine Bluffs. But what do you think it would look like at Pine Bluffs? We dug down.
Shallow.
Lots of rocks, maybe. Might be shallow. Shallow. Do you think it'd have this nice color that we're always looking for? That nice dark color. Okay. So usually that dark color, Catherine said you've already had one class. So what's that dark color usually represent? Soil. It's the thing we're always after, right? Organic matter, right? Yep, which usually tends to have some nitrogen in it, right? Things we really need. So do you think that one in Pine Bluffs is going to be that dark color? Do you think it's going to be a deep? No. Okay. So this plant also kind of gives it away too, right? Everybody know what that plant is? Yucca, right? Some nice, good edible tops on here. If you're into grilling, they go good on the grill. Pine fiber, just a heads up. So it probably is not. So what's one thing about yucca? You can keep this in the back of your mind as you're driving around the rest of Wyoming from here on out. I see yucca, I know I have sandy soils. Okay, it really loves sandy soils. So if you have a gardener that calls you and says, I need help, I can't get this yucca plant to grow in my backyard, and you do a quick texture and you see there's a ton of clay, you might know right away what the issue is, right? So for sure, I know that there's probably a lot of sand in the soil, so I know it's probably not going to look exactly the same. Some other things. It might be a little tough to tell here, but there's little bits of white, okay? So we tend to have a lot of other things that are happening with our soils, a lot of calcium. We can have lots of salt issues that happen, right? So depending on where we're at, what's going on, somebody's backyard, they may have a lot of those salts closer to the soil surface, right? Which makes it tough for plants to grow. So some places, you know, this one, they're a little bit further down, so maybe it gets enough precipitation, it kind of pushes those salts down throughout the year. So we're gonna have a lot of different stuff that's going on. But the thing is, we can make assumptions like this one here at Pine Bluffs of what's going on, but we really don't know until we dig down and see what's happening, right? So that's the thing that's a little bit tough about soils. Nobody has come out with the technology where they just can stand above something and just tell you exactly what the soil profile looks like, right? We have to use some sort of mechanical device to get down. That might be me with a shovel. Maybe there's some other, you know, probe that we can use or something like that. But really, that's the challenge that we have with a lot of our soils is to figure out what's going on.
What's causing the fraction in that soil?
There's probably a little bit of clay that might be there. So when it dries out, it tends to shrink and swell, and then it causes those cracks that are there. Would be my guess. Yep, great question. Okay, so here's why we're all worried about it, right? We want that nice zucchini plant, right? That's the real reason we're here. Okay, you can humor me and say yes. Okay, so yeah, it provides air, which we don't think about sometimes, right? So it provides air for things to move around. It provides nutrients. It holds on to that water. Okay, we're going to talk about the different types of soil and which ones hold on to water better than others. And then it allows things to take a root, right? So they don't hopefully blow away in Wyoming's wind. So, so that's another thing. So this next section, I talk about soil horizons, soil characteristics, classifications. This stuff can get really, I don't know, burdensome, tough to keep track of. There's lots of weird words that are associated with it. But for what I put this up is, this might help you think about or categorize different types of soils for how you think about house calls, how you think about gardening, how you recommend things to folks. So I put these up here. You may end up using these, you may not, but we're going to go ahead and work through some of them just so you have an idea. Okay, so they're separated out into 12 soil orders. So they're broken out based on different characteristics. We're going to talk about them, okay? You know, you might have some of these characteristics in your garden. you may not, right? So, so I think for Wyoming, sometimes we can put those in different categories, and that kind of gives you a baseline of where you maybe need to start. So if we think about soils, they're usually what they're called horizons, okay, or profiles. So we had that one from Saratoga, and we could see that there was different distinct layers, right? So obviously those layers are affected by what gets moved in. Maybe some of that gets washed in from somewhere else. Some of that probably develops from the biology, right? The plant life, the community that's there. So if we think about a topsoil in Iowa, why is it that nice, deep, rich, dark color? Lots of times. What do we have going on there that doesn't necessarily happen at that picture by continental glacier? We have lots of water during what, like warm periods, right? So we have lots of plant growth. So we have stuff that's growing throughout the year, stuff that dies and then gets put back into that soil, right? If you think about the one continental glacier, you're getting like hardly any of that. Let's see, I'm gonna let somebody in here. So yeah, we think about it from that aspect, there's a lot of different things that are happening, right? So there's plants that enjoy the cool part of the summer. There's plants that enjoy the warm part of the summer, right? So Catherine went over cool season and warm season vegetables, right? And biology probably. So we think about that. The one at the glacier, what? It only has what kind of plants? Cool season, right? Okay, so they only have one short growing season. So we have what's called the organic horizon. So lots of times an O horizon. So where I'm at in Laramie, a lot of the hay meadows have an O horizon, okay? So it might not make a whole lot of sense that Laramie has a bunch of O horizons because we're so dang cold, right? But we do. And part of what happens there is sometimes we can have different species that can encourage that. So one of the plants is Garrison creeping foxtail, and it builds up this really thick thatch layer, and it doesn't allow any other plants to move in. So sometimes that O horizon might just simply be caused by the plants that we have, right? So we deal with that, even though it's probably not a scenario where we necessarily say this makes sense, but we can have an O horizon. So that's usually really rich in nutrients. So that O horizon in Laramie, once those plants have established that, the only way to break that up and release nutrients is to actually use fertilizer or go through and actually physically break it up with a tractor, rake it up or something like that. And there's usually thousands of pounds of nitrogen that can be locked up in some of those O horizons. So, so managing that can be pretty challenging for folks. So,
I went to
what's that?
school 3 years in Laramie, and was never able to produce sweet corn.
No, you can't. Yeah, so generally we usually have a frost about every month, depending on the summer. So last summer we were fine, but 3 summers ago it froze hard every single month. So it's a warm season plant, so it's not going to do well with frost periods and makes it tough. So, so yeah, sometimes we can end up with some of these things because there's not other plants to compete. But the other thing that's important is this A horizon. Okay, so that's what we generally think of as topsoil. So when we go out to our lawn, generally we're digging into this A horizon. That's what we're worried about. Most of our garden soil we're treating as this A horizon. Okay, so this is usually where most of our nutrients are. Okay, so for a lot of the red desert places where I grew up around Lavender, that A horizon may only be that thick, right? So it's really, really small. Usually doesn't have a ton of organic matter in that soil, which makes it pretty tough if we then decide to try and turn things into a big vegetable patch, right? Okay, then as we move down, we start to get into the B horizon. Okay, so that's usually a little bit deeper, tends to be a lot thicker than the A horizon. Those are where we tend to see a lot of our mineral accumulations lots of times. We don't see as much of the plant roots, right? We might see a few, but definitely not as many as we would in that A horizon. We do have some pretty cool plants here in Wyoming, sagebrush, for example, right? Which can go way down to that B and C horizon and actually bring water up later up in the summer. So we have some great plants that have figured that out. If we go to some of the spots, you know, on the west side of the Laramie Range, as we start getting towards Laramie there into town, you'll see that lots of times there might be some, you know, junipers or limber pines, different things like that, that might be around some rocks, which wouldn't maybe make sense, but lots of times they figured out how to get way down in those cracks. There might be a very, very small A and B horizon, but they've kind of got down into this C horizon and gone way down into the cracks in the soil. So once we get to the C horizon, that's where we tend to get close to like bedrock. Okay, so that can be another important part. Another important part to think about this is, I'll use Laramie for example, is we have a hard bedrock. Lots of times we call it parent material in the soil world. So if you think about Laramie, there's quite a bit of flood irrigation, right? Not as much as what we see here in Laramie County, but as you drive around, you'll see, you know, green on one side of the ditch and then brown nasty on the other side, right? Okay. So one of the things that happens is we tend to have a lot of salts that are naturally here in Wyoming, right? Okay. They're just here from the parent material. And they're just one of those things we have to deal with. So one of the interesting things about, you know, flood irrigation and different types of irrigation in Wyoming in general is sometimes if we do a lot of water throughout this entire horizon or profile, we can lots of times pick up salt. So you'll see lots of times where there won't be any salt-loving plants on the bottom side or on the top side of the ditch, but there will be on the bottom side of the ditch. Basically, they probably natively weren't there. They are native plants, but they've moved in because of that irrigation. They've been bringing in more of those salts higher up into that soil profile, so where those plants tend to love it. So greasewood is a great example. It can handle water that's even saltier than salt water. And lots of times you'll see that on the bottom side of ditches where it's bringing up those salts. So kind of interesting stuff. All right. Okay, soil texture. So this is where we get to do some of the most fun stuff, right? We're going to do some hands-on things here in a minute. So there's really three main particle sizes that we're worried about. Okay, so clay, which is the smallest, silt, which is about the medium size in the middle there, sand, which is the largest. So if you think about sand, that's pretty dang small, right? You know, it fits in your hand. It's pretty tough to really see, you know, all those fine particles, but on a soil aspect, it's actually the largest. So if we think about soils, they get really, really small for how they're made up for all the different particles. Okay, so this is the thing about sand. So what do you think you have for a good chunk of soils for around Laramie County? It's a good, pretty sandy, right? Yep. So there's a good portion of sand throughout most of Laramie County. Not for all of them, but probably for a good chunk of them, you have quite a bit of sand. So there's some things that are good about sand, some things that are not so good. One of the good things is those spaces between the sand particles are called macropores. And it's really good for plants, or really easy for plants to pick up water. Okay, so if there's water in those, they can pick up the water right away. The bad part is they tend to drain out really fast. So if it rains an inch and then things look really dry and sick about 4 or 5 days later in Laramie County or around Laramie, like where I live as well, because it's been really hot, really dry right after that rain, and you have sandy soils, why is that? It's already drained out, right? It's only there for a short period of time, okay?
What about in the vegetable garden? Is it advisable to add sand to that, some of that, or you've had problems getting water into the soil?
So if it's a clay soil, like you've had problems with the clay soil?
We got the soil from the Cheyenne recycling.
Okay. Yeah, so sometimes you can. That's a great question. So Callie Bellin, who used to teach this class for a long time, she'd always say, don't, because mixing clay and sand usually turns to concrete. So sometimes we can do that. But one thing we can do is usually add organic matter to try and help out with that. So yeah, sometimes sand can help out, but sometimes if we think about it, there's a lot of volume. Okay, so you'd have to lots of times add a lot of sand to make up for, especially in like a yard situation. A garden's a lot easier, right? But sometimes it can work, sometimes you can end up with a wreck. So yeah, good question. So silt somewhere in the middle, right? So we kind of have some fairly good water holding capacity. It also has some that's available, so that's great. Clay, that's great too, because it can hold a lot of water. So that's really cool. The problem is it's really hard for plants to get water out of that clay soil. So it tends to bind it up really tight. We tend to have a lot of chemistry that happens with clay soils. I for sure am not a soil chemistry person. That was not my enjoyment with soils, more on the physics side of it, but there's a lot that can happen with clay soils, which makes it interesting. So they can be in different shapes as well, which can affect how plants are able to put their roots in there. Okay, we're going to try doing a video here. Hopefully everyone on Zoom can hear us. So I'm going to try and incorporate a few videos tonight, mix it up a little bit so you don't have to hear me drown on and on. Unfortunately, I'm in this YouTube.
Is there like a magical mixture of like, would you say like 30% sand, some organic?
So,
Is there
yeah.
like a magical combination that we should be looking for?
So yeah, if you hear the word loam, that's usually like somewhere in the middle. So we're going to look at a soil triangle here in a little bit. We'll kind of see where that's at. Yep.
Friends would walk up to me and be like, what the f is in your mug? And I would tell them, it's
Understanding your soil texture is important for gardening and landscape. There are three main particle sizes that make up soil. The largest is sand, it will feel gritty. The second is silt. Silt is going to feel smooth, basically like cornstarch. And the third size, which is the smallest, is clay, which actually almost feels sticky, similar to silicone. When we think about soils, we generally want a mix of all three particle sizes. Sandy soils can't hold very much water, but the water that is there is generally readily available for plant roots to uptake. Clay soils, on the other hand, can hold a lot of water, yet not all of that water is quite as readily available to plant roots. Clay soils can also hold a lot more nutrients as compared to sandy soil. A quick way to actually figure out what you might have for a soil texture in your garden is to use a flow chart. The basic principles of this is to simply take some soil, wet it in your hand, follow through the chart, and then you can determine what your soil texture is. Knowing what your soil texture is will help you not only improve your nutrient and water management throughout the season, but hopefully provide you with a better garden and landscape in wonderful Wyoming. From the University of Wyoming Extension, I'm Brian Sebade. Well, the good thing is, you now know my fashion has not changed. One of the odds I wear the same shirt. Well, those who know me know that there's a really good odd that it's going to be the same shirt. So. Okay, let's do that. What do you think? Everybody brought some soil?
You can use mine.
Okay, cool. Let's do it. Okay, so everybody should have this handout. So when we figure out texture of soil, there's really three ways that we can do it. There's probably even more ways, but the three main ways we think about is we can do a hand texture. Okay, so we use our hand. If we send this off to a lab, they're going to use a hydrometer and they're going to time how that hydrometer moves down. Okay, with our soil sample. We aren't going to do that. The other one is to crush it up and then put it through different sieves, okay? You sieve it out, and then you see what portions end up in each sieve. We don't have that. We're not going to do that tonight, but those are the options. The other one is there's some cool bottle tests that you can do where basically you can shake them up and then time it as well. It's kind of similar to the hydrometer. So this one is, this is her garden soil. This is Catherine's garden soil on my left. And then this is the community garden soil, I guess, on the right. So you can look at the color. You know, you can also look to see what parts are there. I kind of like the hand texture. It's the most, you know, kind of, I guess, for lack of better terms, the one that's used the most commonly. It's really nice because if you show up somewhere, you don't need a bottle, you just need a little bit of water, and you usually can figure it out. So, so yeah, let's do that. Does that work? As Kelly Belden always reminded me, if you have rings with stones, take them off because clay soils can actually loosen a lot of the stones in the rings. So I don't wear any rings, so I don't know these things, but that's what she always said. So we don't want to lose any diamonds or anything in soil. So let's just spread out a few of these if there's some areas. And we think we've got some water. There's a water fountain down the way. We can get some extra water. And we'll just get after it here. So if you don't have a soil, I can lend you some. I bet somebody else can borrow one. Do you want a table to spot? Where else? You can stand up, just be interactive. I don't want people falling asleep. It's so much fun. Want one back here?
Oh, we need it. Sure. You'll make a difference. Are we jumping there?
So it might be helpful, maybe you watch me do one at the front of the room here, and then we'll move on to do our own. How's that sound? That work? Okay, watch me and we'll see how it goes. Okay, so this is out of my garden in one bed. So it can be all nasty, whatever, right? So what we're doing though, is we want to take a handful, okay? So take a handful, and what we're going to have to do, especially if this is a clay type soil, we're going to have to be a little bit patient to work in all the water, okay? So we're going to kind of make basically a mud pie. We'll kind of just keep squishing around, slowly adding, okay? Work it around. One thing that you can do while you're doing this is really think about in your hand, you know, how's it sticking together, right? Can you feel any grittiness to it? This one obviously has quite a bit of organic matter, okay? So it's going to take a little bit of time for it to absorb some of the water. And so what we're going to do is we're just trying to get a handful. And this is what's challenging about garden soil. Sometimes you end up with, you know, pieces of gravel and other things where maybe it's not as consistent as other things. But what we're doing is we're just trying to work that water in, okay? We're trying to go through and we're going to look to see if it makes a ball, right? So that's number one. Okay, so if I go over there by Pine Bluffs, is it going to make a ball in my hand? It may not. Okay, perfect. There we go. Okay, so I want to keep going. I want to make sure that it's thoroughly soaked all the way through. Okay. You can kind of experiment for what you think be enough or not enough.
Yeah, this is the vegetable.
Okay, so then once I've got it saturated, then I'm going to go through and I'm going to make what's called a ribbon. So that's where I'm going to squish it between my thumb and my forefinger. And what I'm trying to do is to see how long that I barely have enough soil here to make it happen. But what I want to do is squish that out to really see how long of a ribbon I can make, okay? So if you have a clay soil, it should make a really long ribbon, right? If it's a sandy soil, it shouldn't make a very long ribbon, okay? So on this one, I'm really not making very long ribbons at all. So what I go to, does it make a ribbon less than 1 inch? I would say yes, it's less than 1 inch. I really have a hard time getting it to be longer than 1 inch. Okay, so there's 3 different areas, less than an inch to 2 inches, greater than 2 inches, okay? Okay, next part, does it feel gritty? Yes, it does. All right. So what I like to do, and what people have shown me as well, is if I think it feels gritty, I'll put a little bit of water in my hand. Before I do that, I kind of feel around, but then I do it again. You really should be able to feel some of those sand particles. They should point out to you if there are some sandy parts in there. So for this one, I'd be at a sandy loam, okay? Loam, it would feel neither gritty or smooth, right? So in the video, we talked about the different things that were there, okay? If it feels more smooth, right, then we probably have a little bit more clay that's in there. So then we go down to the silt foam. Okay, so does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so try those out, see where you get. I'll kind of walk around. Have at it. Go for it.
Yeah, and I don't think, I guess it's not,
It's water.
Yeah, depending on where I would get the soil, it all we have is some sand, some places. This is actually from my garden. But I've not really done anything to that soil, I just took out the trimmers. But I
Now, we are really glad of our one and
No little cups. You can use my jug of water. How's that? Yeah. I'll just keep filling it up. Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good. I already put my ball back in.
Okay.
So I don't even think I got our square.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's some in there. Yeah, you're probably gonna,
Because when I'm doing this, it's very gritty. When I do this, I've had to. Well, you're gritty. So I'm gonna.
Yours looks really dry.
Yeah.
See, I didn't dry it.
yeah, I would really put it at, might be more in this.
Okay.
There's still some great food, but not like that.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you. Thank you.
Wow.
So you're probably close to probably like
So.
that'd be good. So then we'll put it in the palm.
It's gritty though, like you're building little pieces of granite.
Yeah.
So.
So I thought
This is quick. I was just gonna say that, but I thought I would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that a ribbon? What you have to do? Oh, okay. No, see, it's dry.
Yeah, so you have one place, it's gonna take some time.
And this one has.
Whole same thing.
What do you think about
But I got a little.
No. I guess I'll.
Well, I guess I got,
Oh, that's great.
well, that's a good point, because look, I'm being able to get. It's still less than an inch, I think.
Yeah, that was pretty good.
You really have to work to get it that far.
And when you're ready,
Well, that'll be the next.
I would say mine has to be.
Not quite as pretty, not quite as pretty, as all the street. Oh, same with the pretty. Bar wash, that one, I.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I've got enough stuff in my hand that I can figure out.
How do we get, how we do?
Well, I got all that dry stuff and it.
Okay. So it's sticky, where do you think you're at? Clay, yeah. So, probably gonna have a little bit more, a little soupy, okay? But I'm guessing you'll be in that, either the second category or maybe in the third category.
So mine is different soil. That's not really making a ribbon very long.
No, so just keep going a little bit further, so you kind of try to push it, right, does that make sense? So yeah, as soon as it breaks off, that's how it goes. That's fine. Right. Probably still in this, probably. Yeah, you can just need to get a few arms. So you probably more in that same place.
So where would you think?
Yeah.
This one.
Yours probably. Yeah.
You gotta get over here.
I got my own.
Sure. I'll email it. Yep.
One of you guys are-
How do you do?
Pretty good.
You've got one that makes it all work well. Oh. How are we doing back here? Having fun? Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna go.
You can be the class example. Yeah.
There's some, there's some.
Yeah.
Little part of it.
More like this, definitely more like that. I would probably use.
So you said you were Sandy Clay?
Neither gritty nor smooth.
Yeah. Yeah. Like if you put it on no, but it's, I don't think so. But you're really, you're like. racing earlier, I don't know. See, I got a. Is that a ribbon? Is that his or is that yours? Yeah.
You're kind of
Yeah,
in between.
a little bit.
That's kind of where it's, between.
Clay mold. This doesn't look like clay. It's always more like clay, so neither pretty nor.
Yeah. I'll be back here.
Confirmed, it's a little green, but kind of smooth also. So I
Okay.
thought this was right smack in the middle of the plate.
Okay, so this one, sandy clay loam or clay loam? Clay loam. Okay. So this is Ken. And where do you think mine is? Yours is larger.
Yours is gonna be in this area.
It's pretty.
And his green.
Well, yeah. You just want her, you just want her to get wet. Here it comes, here.
Yeah, you don't want this,
That's why.
Oh, yeah.
Prettier than mine.
Yeah, so it's so pretty, yes. Not clay.
Right.
Okay.
So sandy loam?
Good.
That kind of makes sense.
All right.
Check it out.
Yeah.
Good, what'd you end up with?
No, it's an elevated garden.
So you're this one? Yeah, that's what Lori. Mine's this one.
Wait a minute.
Yep.
Totally different.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Oh, no, I insist.
I already claimed that.
No, no buyers, okay. Yeah, it's a little green, but it's smooth on it. But.
Even the way it dries
made a
on
long-
your
made a long.
You should make a lot. Cool.
You having fun?
It looks like the dog had an accident there. So do we just dump everything into the wastebasket? What do we do with all this stuff?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. That works for me.
Ken's got quite a bit of dirt here, so I'll save that for him.
I tried to do this so it was sitting here lying there.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably.
I think I was. Can I save your bag of dirt?
Yes.
Is there a custodial closet?
I have no idea. We'll just chat with Kathy later. I think we can let them dry and we'll get them off. Yeah, thank you.
We were messing.
You were.
Alright. Spring's not that far away, right? Just ready for my season.
I don't live there.
Lettuce per day?
I'm glad it's the fireplace because this is really important stuff and there's no way I can capture it all. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm mentioned that.
Yeah.
But all I know. And right, it's like the horse trough and stuff. Those are actually really pretty. Just plant one. One eggplant go. Like the airplane. We've got shade.
Okay, did everybody get a restroom break? Got a chance to wash their hands?
And then very hot on the other side.
How'd everybody on Zoom do? I see Kathy Newell's. Kathy, did you see anything? Hopefully then. Okay. So what do you think? You think you go to somebody's backyard and do that if you needed to? At least get a rough idea whether it was a clay, whether it was a sand, okay? Then make recommendations on watering from there. Yeah, lots of the head nod, yes, all right, cool. If this guy up here yakking away can figure it out, you can figure it out too, right? Okay, so if you want to look on page 2 of this handout, there's a triangle deal there. So on this, it kind of goes into, it correlates to those different categories you ended up with. Okay, so you can see on there, we have clay, which tends to be the really large chunk at the top of the triangle, right? And then we move into all the different sections, okay? So this is, so say what we have, sandy loam. We can go through there and we can actually look at what percents of sand, silt, and clay it would take to fit into those different categories. So that kind of answers your question of if you want a loam, what percent of those different things. Okay. So what's one thing you notice about the very like top 2/3 of that triangle? What words in most of those? Clay, right? Okay. So, you know, for a lot of these, they do have quite a bit of clay in them. So, but just keep in mind, you know, if you're sand, it's going to be far different than if you're in that clay section. Okay. Okay, the next part. We're going to talk about water, right? Everything's always dry. I feel like 90% of my job in the summer is just telling people to water more. Maybe for an idiot like me, it's a good thing, right? I can figure out what to tell people, but it's one of those things that's really challenging. So a lot of it has to do with our soils, right? They tend to dry out really fast. They don't have a whole lot of organic matter, which helps hold water. So if we want to improve a soil to hold more water, what's one thing we can do? Add more organic matter, okay? So organic matter helps bind things, helps make nutrients available, helps with water holding capacity. So it's one of those things that just fixes everything. So it's really awesome for that, okay? So there's this chart. So this one is one of those things that I tend to look at every now and then, but just kind of have a mental image in the back of my mind, right? So if I have a sand or a sandy loam, I notice that I really can't store that much water, right? So if I'm watering a sandy site in my landscape, how often do I need to water? Pretty often, right? Okay, so it's one of those deals of, you know, we think we water, but again, we tend to be sandy, we tend to not have a lot of organic matter outside of our gardens, so then we're drying out really fast. So for most of us with our garden, vegetable garden, we're probably okay, but where do most of my calls come from? Lawns. Why is my tree dying, right? I've got one little drip emitter to a 20-foot blue spruce. Why is it dying? Right? It's not getting enough water. The little water it's getting is either draining out or evaporating really fast. And the other part, whatever plant roots are there, it's getting sucked up right away. So thinking about that is really important. Thinking about, we're going to talk more about how water moves through soil is also really important. Okay, so again, these are the
Water you put there, whether it's surface water or whether it's sprinkler water or whether it's out of a tube or.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that, how we want that water to be more evenly distributed. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So yeah, good point. Good point. Yep. So these are the ways that we can test, which we already talked about. There's an article on barnyards and backyards if you need more information. Written by a guy that tends to wear the same shirt everywhere. Okay, this is what good soil has. Soil aggregates. Okay. So everybody see what those things are? See how I kind of knock it around and it sticks together? Okay, that's what we really want. We want thick soil that sticks together. Okay, prevents from erosion, from wind, water, other things like that. Helps bind things so that way we can have good activity with microorganisms and different things like that as well. So that's important. We also have micropores, okay? So they create pores in the soil. They're these tiny little pores that end up hosting a lot of water, can hold a lot of water, which is really great. But the thing to remember is it moves really slowly. So we're going to talk more about your question in a minute too, about how things move around as far as water, when you should water, and things related to maybe some natural rain we get. Okay. So soil disturbance destroys structure, right? So there is a video we have, but I don't put it up here, of recreational tilling. So I do a radio show with Torrington, I guess Goshen County Extension every spring and summer. And one of the hosts, he's a big into the recreational tilling, so we always give each other a hard time. So why do we not want to do recreational tilling? Anybody know?
Yeah, this will make it soil compact.
It can make it compact, yep. But it breaks up those aggregates, right? These things that we're after, where it's all binding together. What else happens as soon as you disturb the soil?
Runoff,
We have to talk about this.
runoff.
Yeah, the potential for that, yep, blown away.
Come up from the,
Microorganisms, worms.
Yep, so you disturb those. And what's another big one? I'm thinking about nutrient management.
oh,
Is water cheaper?
You lose a ton of carbon and nitrogen as soon as you disturb the soil. Okay, so there's a lot of things that we end up losing. So the main thing is if you're going to do some tilling, make sure you're incorporating organic matter back into that soil. So tilling's fine every now and then, but we usually end up with a lot more issues by lots of tilling.
Are there, so is
Yeah.
there any way to incorporate more organic matter without tilling?
Sure.
How?
You can put it out over the ground. If it's a garden bed, you can lay it out over the winter. All those sorts of things work. So some people do
So
what
that's
they.
enough, that would be considered adding organic matter, like working into. it.
Yep. So yeah, yep, great question.
I have a perennial bed that has that same issue. I don't want to dig it up, but the soil's getting kind of tired. So I'm just gonna like cover it, leaves, and put like a little dirt on top and just hope for a snow or something?
Yeah, so the main thing is we want to make sure that it's actual organic matter, right? So we want stuff that's already been composted, right? So we don't want stuff, I mean, we can do like leaves and lawn clippings, right? But how long does it take for us to compost? My backyard, Laramie. 10 years? I don't know. I've had a pile of grass sitting there for 5 years and it's not done anything, right? So the main thing is thinking about stuff that's already compost or that's already organic. So that's what's going to move in there quicker. So my garden bed, I'll put leaves and grass in there and I'll try to keep it wet. I'm trying to basically kind of pretend I'm doing some sort of composting, right? But that's really not what I'm getting as true organic matter back in.
So what kind of organic matter exactly? I just direct compost, like.
So you can do stuff that you composted. Can you buy from the city dump here?
Yes, you
Okay.
can, and I started with their dirt
Okay,
many years ago.
so you can buy, so in Laramie, you can buy organic matter, not topsoil, but organic matter from the dump. You can also buy bags, something that's already been done. So things that don't count is manure that hasn't composted, leaf sticks, whatever that hasn't composted. It's all good stuff, right? But the problem is when it's not composted already, then it's just kind of hanging out, right? So lots of times too, challenges that we have is if we throw a bunch of that stuff in there, a lot of those microbes end up eating it up, but they also have to use a lot of the nitrogen in our soil to make that happen. So sometimes if we add a bunch of like carbon in there, then they have to use that. So the best thing is just making sure that it's something that's already done. So it's already been treated. So for me, I don't consider, adding organic matter in my garden. I don't consider the mixture of leaves and grass. I don't consider that. I'm adding something to it, but I'm not considering that organic.
Would straw be the same as like leaves?
Yep. Yes, sir.
Catherine talked to us about alfalfa pellets.
Uh-huh.
Britain knows that you kind of like almost got a feeling like a magical thing when she was talking about it.
Yeah. So a lot of those things are kind of called green manure. Okay, so you hear a lot about cover crops that people put on gardens or in big ag fields. Basically, that's kind of green manure. So that stuff's slowly going to break down, but it's not going to fix an issue right away, right? So if you have really low organic matter in your soil, those things are great, but you have to continue to add those. And they're not going to be as fast as if you already have something that's compost. That makes sense.
There's, with the alfalfa pellets, it still has to go through the composting process in the soil.
Yeah, for that organic matter side of things. From a nutrient standpoint, it's probably pretty close to being ready, if that makes sense. Yep. Yeah, great question. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay. You don't look convinced, but you keep asking me. You need something, right? So, yeah, great question. So yeah, try to get the stuff that's already done. And for us, that's really challenging, right? So for me and Laramie, I probably need to think about like a black barrel or something like that where I can get it hot enough, keep it wet enough. We're going to talk a little bit more about composting later on, but keeping things wet enough is probably our biggest challenge. So this is kind of a rough sketch of what we might have for like a sandy soil. So you can see that there's lots of open space, right? Lots of air. We probably would have water that clings to each of these particles, which makes it fairly easy for plants to get that water, but it also dries out from the air or moves through that soil profile really fast. So this, we obviously can't hold the water. We have lots of different ways that clay particles stack up, the way that they look. This is kind of one of those, just quick and easy, trying to think about it. But within each of those particles, they tend to have these little dots, which are basically micropores. And so we actually get water that sticks into each one of those. So the challenge with that is they can hold a lot of water, but it's tough for plants to get water out of those micropores, right? So if you think about a plant root, they really have to try and work at it to get that out. So that's where our challenges in place are. But We have lots of different ways that these soil structures might look, okay? They might be angular, they might be platy, right? So if they're platy, sometimes that makes it tough for water to go through, plant roots to go through. You might get these layers of where, you know, basically you have water sitting all the time just because it can't break through that. We might have different structures for how they are in that soil horizon or that soil profile, okay? The point to this is we don't need to memorize all this, but we just need to know that there's a lot going on. So my soil may physically look different than somebody else's soil, and that might be the reason why they don't act the same, okay? These are those 12 soil orders we talked about earlier. This is a cool poster you can get from the NRCS. If you're looking for wall art, I guess this is what you can go with. So yes, on here we have different groups that we talked about, right? And so for here in Wyoming, we tend to have, you know, a lot of our soils fit just to a few of those categories. So as I'm thinking about different soils, how that might be different in somebody's landscape where they haven't irrigated a lot as compared to a vegetable garden, I'm trying to put these into categories in my head. So if we think about a mollisol, I showed that picture from the Platte River. Looks fairly similar to that one on the left, right? So we have this dark A horizon where we've had lots of good things happening in the soil, right? Plant roots are decaying each year. We've had good growth. Things have been well managed. Those are really productive soils. We actually have these in Wyoming, believe it or not, even though we wouldn't think that we do. But these are the soils we're generally at, right? So lots of times if we're in a garden, we might be thinking more along this line of, we might be in more of this situation, right? Or maybe even a well irrigated lawn, stuff like that. These alpha sols, these can be in a lot of our forested areas. Okay, so if I go somewhere and I'm doing a house call and it's somebody that has a lot of trees going on, I might be thinking about that. So it's probably not as applicable to Laramie County, but you know, you may get to cultivate areas in the Laramie range at times. So usually there's been a lot of leaching that's happened lower down in those horizons. These are rhidosols, okay? So these are probably more of what I'm used to in central Wyoming, right? Very arid soils. There's not a lot of organic matter in there. There's usually not really well-defined horizons, okay? It might go from small rocks to big rocks, right? So these are those ones where if I'm out there thinking about somebody's lawn, and I can tell looking around like, oh, they probably are built on a rhidosol. There's probably a lot of things I need to be recommending to that homeowner as compared to this mollisol, right? So for me, I kind of try to think about those things as I'm giving recommendations. If you're getting questions from somebody, why is this happening? That could be a good reason to, you know, try and think about this. Okay, so you might fit more into these entisols, where we have a really sandy soil, right? Where I, you know, see a lot of the yucca around Laramie, it is something that looks almost exactly like. It's just very, very sandy, right? So if we get some water, it's going to drain out or evaporate right away. So if we try to improve this one at all, what would we need to do? Organic matter, you got it. Easy answers in this class. Okay. Okay. These histosols, okay, sometimes you might see these in like peats or bogs. This is almost a scenario I end up seeing with a lot of the irrigated meadows around Laramie, which is interesting. Okay. They can be in cool, wet areas. Again, you're probably not going to run into a ton of these, but where do you maybe see this as a master gardener? What's that?
Be in a garden.
Be in a garden. I'm up here preaching add organic matter, so what do? Add more and more organic matter, right? So we end up adding so much, it sometimes turns into a peat or a bog, right? We water it as much as possible because Brian said, number one issue is people don't water enough, and they don't use enough organic matter. Well, yes, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing sometimes. So keep that in mind. You may end up in a situation where it's like, holy cow.
So question,
Yes,
would that be a wetlands, the soil that would be in a wetlands area?
yeah, pretty similar.
Okay.
Yep, very good. So, so I have another same position as Catherine, but she's in Natrona County, and I forget what percent organic matter she had somebody come in for their garden, but it was like, oh my gosh, it was just unreal. She literally just had added so much that it was like, maybe we could hold off a bit. So, so it can happen. You may run into that, just so you're aware. You know, so insectisols are another one, okay? You know, these are kind of, you know, generally, you know, a little bit like newer type soils. So maybe you're in one of these rocky areas or someplace where things just haven't developed over a long period of time. I also tend to like this category, thinking about going to a house call where somebody's had dirt work done. They built a new house. Things have been moved around, right? So I use this category in my mind of what all has changed, right? Everything's been flip-flopped around. There's no more A horizon, right? But they're trying to grow all these things. So I try to use that category for when I go to new houses, new buildings and things like that. So you can take that, you can leave it. That works in my brain. If that does not make sense, please ignore it. But just so you're aware, that's how things are grouped. Yes, ma'am.
If you have that histosol in your garden, or is it okay to dig some of that out and move it to an area in your flower beds or whatever that might not be as rich? And
Sure.
kind of,
Yep.
yeah, mix like that. I know you're disturbing the soil structure, but
Yeah. No, you can do that. That always helps. You know, some of that really rich stuff, sometimes you can add a little bit to your compost pile to help add some microorganisms there too. So yeah, that's a good use for it. There's also some things that happen underneath these things. I guess we tend to always, in my mind, right, growing up, it's like, oh, well, everything's just smooth, right? In Wyoming, is that the case? No, we're all jumbled. We're all over the dang place, right? So, you know, sometimes I'll go to somebody's house and like Laramie is a great example. One part of the yard is doing great, and I'll get to one corner and I can kind of look over and see like some exposed bedrock or something, right? And I just know things are changed a lot, right? So yeah, of course, those trees where that exposed bedrock are, you know, it's really different, right? All of a sudden, there might be very little soil at all before they hit bedrock as compared to further down in that property where all the trees are doing well. So, you know, looking at some of those things is also really important. So, you know, right around Cheyenne, you might be okay. Things might be fairly even, maybe just wavy. But as you go to some house calls up towards the Laramie Range or other places, start thinking about things are not just smooth underneath, right? Things are all over the place for how those layers are situated. So this is the other part. So for a lot of our semi-arid west, we might be 2% or less. Okay, that's pretty dang low, right? We're not storing a lot of water with 2%. We don't have a lot of nutrients that are available for plants. That's why we have plants that don't grow very tall, right? But it's important to think about too that we have quite a bit of that can be water and air. And then the rest of that that's actually soil. Okay, so there's a lot of area in that soil profile for water and air, which is important. Okay, talk a little bit more about Kelly Belden. I always like to point out this is her slide, and she was always really great about probably hammering it more than I am, but it did. So it acts like a glue, right? So it helps bind things together. It provides stuff for organisms to eat. Okay, it's really good for that. You know, it's one of those things that helps absorb moisture. It can help with, you know, different textures of soil. So it's just one of those things that can help all around build up our soil to what we need. So it's really important for that aspect. Again, all these sorts of things which are really important. Decreases erosion, especially if you're in a windy spot, right? Okay. We talked about this already. We got there. So, you know, if you can add 1 to 2 inches, that's great. Yes, sir.
Is the microorganism given within in all the soils, or are there soils that are needed?
Yeah, so good question. So almost all have some, but if we think about a lot of like topsoil piles or different, you know, piles that have been, you know, dug up for either like mining or for building a new garage, lots of times that disturbance is sitting there for so long, it really depletes a lot of what's there. So as we think about that, we have to be patient to try and get those soils back to where they have lots of good living things that are there. So that's one of the things, you know, even with mine land reclamation, they kind of looked at is, you know, even having a few weeds on top of a, you know, pile of soil that's been dug up over the years. You know, we don't want to spread weeds, but they are adding some benefit of kind of facilitating some microorganisms in there. So yeah, sometimes you may encounter where, you know, a pile of soil's been sitting out and not a whole lot's been happening. A lot of those have died. So yeah, yep, good question. Okay, we all know why not to recreational till? All right. Okay, we doing all right? Hanging in there? Okay. Okay, we're going to talk about water. So this is really important. Again, we're going to look at this. Okay, so we have that field capacity. So that's how much we can actually have that's stored in the soil. We get below that point, and then everybody's calling us going, why does my plant look sick, right? So we want to stay in that sweet spot where we don't drown things, but we have water that's available.
Is there any way to measure that sweet spot?
Well, that's a good question. We're going to talk about that in just a second. You're in luck. I only have 6 handouts, so we're going to have to share, but we will talk about that. Okay, so there's some different things that act on soil for how water moves around. We're not going to get stuck on this, you know, in great detail, but we're going to touch on this a little bit. Okay, so gravitational potential, right? That's the force of gravity. Okay, so you asked me about when
Yeah,
you should water,
there's-
right?
If there's rain in the forecast, do you water your lawn before the rain, during the rain, after the rain, or none of the above?
Okay, so saturated soils, this is the most critical, right? So is it going to rain a lot or a little?
Exactly, yeah. Who knows?
If it's going to rain 1/4 of an inch, I probably would water beforehand. Why? Because I know with this gravitational potential, it's going to move better through saturated soils. Okay, so it's going to move a little bit faster and it's going to infiltrate a little bit better. So if we get that 1/4 inch in 10 minutes, 20 minutes, as it sometimes happens, I would want to have my soil wet before that got there. Yep. So,
That applies to lawn, garden, flowers,
yep.
all the above.
Yep. Yep, exactly. I wouldn't want to water to the point of where it's at that field capacity, right? But I probably want to make sure that I am somewhere here, and then we can hopefully fill up from there. And we're going to use these guides so we know where that sweet spot is. Okay, osmotic potential, okay? That's the attraction to ions in the soil, okay? So we think about, you know, how we used to look at all those things in class, right? You know, that's how we have a lot of this that moves. So if we have a lot of salts that are present in our soil, this kind of messes with that, right? Sometimes it might hold on to a lot of that water and not make it available to plants. It might make it tough to move from one area to another, but this is another part that can be challenging. So if you do a soil test and you end up with a bunch of you know, salts and other things that are in your soil, this is something to be thinking about, how that's probably not working real great. Okay, this is adhesion to the soil particles for the matrix potential. Okay, this is another part. This is for unsaturated soils when we're thinking about this, okay? So this is one of those, we think about energy, how things move around. You can think about a beaker of water, for example. And there are the pores in the soil. Water below the top has a positive pressure. Cut me off. Oh, geez. People on Zoom are going, what is it really talking about? I can't even blame Catherine, she's not here. Okay, so where's that at? Below the top has positive pressure, and the water that rises above is negative. Okay, so the point with all this is there's like 3 different things working on it. So it's one of those things like put water out on your lawn and you go, well, why didn't it move through there, right? Well, it could be because it's already dry. So if it's saturated, it might move through there a little bit easier. Maybe we have a lot of salts or other things that are in there preventing it as well. But the big thing is we need to think about all these in combination and kind of just figuring out that each place is a little bit different, right? So the total water potential is all of these that's put together. Usually you have to use a lab experiment to figure these all out. So the point of this is we just kind of have to figure out what's the best place, right? A lot of this stuff, there's no way that even somebody that's into high-tech ag is probably going to do all these sorts of things to figure it out. But one thing that we can do is we can kind of use some hand tests. So, so one of the things that we have, maybe people on Zoom can see me now. We'll have to share these. I'll get these. I think I have some websites we can look at these, but maybe kind of pass these around if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah.
So cool.
You have a love affair with soil.
What's that?
I think you have a love affair with soil.
Oh, man, I probably do. Don't tell too many people, though, okay? I don't want those plant people thinking I do.
That looks like it.
Okay, so this is a really cool deal. This is from the NRCS. And this is really nice because we can actually kind of use a similar test to what we did for the field texture method. And essentially we can put it in our hand and we can see how it sticks to our hand. Okay, so once you know your texture, then you can go through this guide, and depending on how it sticks to your hand, you can then estimate how much water you might need to add to get to the field capacity, right? So this is a really good one. If you go to somebody's house, you figure out what their texture is, then you put that soil in your hand, and you obviously probably had to add water to your hand, right? To make it for the texture part. Then you can go back through and actually recommend how many inches of water they would need to bring or put down to bring it up to field capacity. So this is a really nice one to say, well, you know, see how this doesn't stick to my hand or see how this does stick to my hand. It's really cool from that aspect. So pass these around. I only have 6 of these. Unfortunately, I'd love to give everybody one, but those are really cool. So I will point out where these are at here in a little bit. But those are really cool. Okay, so capacity, okay? So how much water we can actually have in it. There's the pores part that we talked about, the micro and macro pores, right? How many of those you have, are they interconnected? There's the colloidal part of it as well, which is the clay and humus, which the humus being organic matter. And that's how much surface area we have, right? So we add organic matter, we increase our surface area. So how those things added up is how much water we can hold. Okay, we're gonna move past that. So again, I always like to put in here, why are we always talking about this? Because if I get 90% of my calls because people aren't watering enough, you as master gardeners are probably going to get 90, 75, 50, I don't know. I'll go with 50. You're probably better on top of it here in Laramie County than out in County. So, okay. So this is that website for these handouts that we have. I'm glad it didn't come up with some commercial where they blocked out the F word. That was nice. So essentially, this is the same thing, okay? But what we have is you can click on there. So some of us had a Sandy Low, right? Find Sandy Low, and they have the actual pictures that are on. Okay, so as you can see, one really doesn't stick together. You're about 25 to 50% available water. Okay, so it's slightly moist. Takes a weak fall. You can barely see your finger indents in there, right? Ball forms, darker color, not slick. Okay, whereas this one, once we really got those soils saturated to where we could put them into a ribbon, we definitely were in that 75 to 100% of water available. So throughout your lawns during the middle of the summer, if you went out and did this, where would you be? Here, depending on the time of day, maybe you're here, right? So depending on what you have. So I think this is a really important thing to think about. It's something that's easily that you can go out and test and see. It's something I should do in my own garden, my own landscape. I don't do it enough, right? But if you do this a lot, you can get a pretty good idea of your watering schedule. Should you be watering more? Should you be watering less? You know, maybe about the timing about it, right? More frequently, all those sorts of things can tie back. Yes, sir.
What about the time of day you just brought up? What's the best time, regardless if you didn't do the shrub or whatever?
Right. So usually when it's not too hot out, right? So early in the morning, late at night. Some people don't like to water at night for fear of fungal issues and different things like that. So early in the morning is usually really great. Plants have that kick of water right before they start doing their stuff, right? So that's a great time. You gonna tell me something different? If you
No.
want, you can tell me something
No,
different.
I'm just gonna say in Cheyenne, in the city, we have watering restrictions. We can only water
Oh.
twice a week. And we cannot water after 10 or before 5. So given that, I mean, we have to conserve water too. So how do you balance?
Yeah, so maybe matching the plant to your soil would be my
Yeah.
answer to that. So I was really hoping you had some cool
No,
answer that,
do you
that
guys
way I
have-
could just divert to you. But
Do you have
okay.
in Laramie, do you guys have water restrictions?
We
or
don't,
not? You don't?
but you know, I think, you know, if you're at that, I would maybe think about some plants that are a little bit more adapted to your soil. And that decreased amount of water, right? So, so for me, if I had to do that, I'd probably have to change up some of the plants I have.
Mhm.
So I think Catherine talks about pollinators and habitat and stuff like that. I forget what it was. But, you know, there's probably some really good ideas she can give you there. We have a lot that's on the barnyards back here at page 2. But yeah, a lot of our native plants end up doing a little bit better with that situation, but they just don't get as big and as nice as some of the other things we like, right? So yeah, good point. Okay, so what do you think? You go check this out?
It's pretty cool.
Okay, it'll be on my stuff that I send out to you, I believe. If not, you can just Google this, estimating soil moisture by feel and appearance. Okay.
So are you shooting for getting to 100% capacity or?
No, you don't need to. You just want to make sure you're in that threshold, right? So if you dig up some and it just like crumbles through your hand, like when I first started with this soil, we probably need some more, right? Plants can get water out of stuff that looks really dry, but most of our ornamentals, especially our vegetable crops, we need to be in that probably 50 to 75%, right? So, yeah. Yep, good question. Okay. Another cool thing that's out there is the web soil survey. So if you're totally bored by all this, do not want to get your hands dirty, then you can go here. Say, I'm done with you, Brian. I'm going to type in my address and I'm going to just figure out what's in my backyard. So the deal with this is, though, it's not going to know exactly what your soil type is in that one corner of your backyard, right? This is just a general idea. So if you have a larger acreage, okay, where you go make a house call to somebody with a larger acreage, this is a good way you can actually look ahead of time if you go out there to do it. I will, let's see. Let's see if I can get the, see if we can do it for my office.
This might be a dumb question, but
Yes.
I'm on the website right now, and a lot of the dates where they've actually surveyed these areas are like older than I've been alive. So the soil has changed a lot. I mean, like over time, like should we take this with a grain of sand?
I don't know, you got a guy that works for him, I don't know, you questioning what he did?
Soil doesn't change that much. And it was a lot of work to do the once over mapping of the entire United States. It probably took them 60, 70 years to get done. It required a man walking or four-wheeling or something or other over every acre of the country.
I would assume going by horseback because for Laramie area, it was 1904.
Well, it should be sooner than that. They're just finishing up harvest.
There might have been an early service.
That might be.
They did some real early on, like a general soil survey, but the more specific one should have been done later than that.
What's the point?
But it gives you a good indication of the type of soil, parent material, textures, all kinds of information about your soil.
Yeah, so the point, say that again now.
So what's the point of having a guy walk the country like that for 150 years to get the soil when you can just go into your yard and figure out what your soil is?
Well, so if you go to somebody's small acreage property that's 40 acres, you're not gonna walk around that 40 acres and do a hand texture throughout the whole thing, right?
Well, somebody did.
Somebody did, right? So that way you can look ahead of time and know what you're dealing with, right? Or have a general idea of what you're dealing with. That way you can look and see, is there probably going to be some salt issues? Is it a really sandy soil? All those sorts of things are done ahead of time, which is really nice. The other thing that's been on there is they incorporated a lot of the crop science, a lot of the range science with that. So you can go through and we can estimate based off of that soil what you might have for annual forage production. If we're in Iowa, you might have an estimate of how much corn you might produce. In Wyoming, they do it for alfalfa as well. So there's a lot of that information as well that's on there.
And also where you want to build houses or factories
Yep.
or roads, or where you want to put septic tanks and where you can't put septic tanks.
Yeah.
And
So yeah,
all kinds of things.
there's a
And
lot of stuff that's
I
on
think
there.
the early ones were like on a half-acre scale. And then it also depended on whether you were in some rural area, like in southeastern Colorado, where there's more cows than people, or whether you were in the Denver or the Cheyenne area, you would be more precise about the size of the soil test that you're doing.
Right, yeah, for sure. And you know, one thing I really like about it is that, say I was going to a property and they told me that they're having an issue in a certain part, you know, maybe it is a wetter area of that property, I can look it up ahead of time. Or get more information if I go there and don't know what's going on, see what's there. So on here, you can find all sorts of information, okay? Once you have your map, click on all these different tabs. It'll talk to you about health stuff, okay, soil health. There's the building classification stuff. This is that one that talks about range production. So if it's a favorable year, I'll click on that. Then I'll hit view rating. And then it gives me the estimate of what those areas would produce for forage, okay? The other part of that, soil properties and qualities, so that's where I can go in there. Physical properties, okay? Organic matter. Like that, too small of a scale. But anyways, we can look at that. We can look at other things. I've got to make it bigger, but we can actually end up getting the physical side of it as well. So it's just a tool. You don't need to use it. It's just out there. I want you to know that it's there. Like I say, since I've been working for Extension, they literally just finished up Carbon County, Laramie. So it takes a long time for them to do that. It's out there. It's a good resource.
So there's two, in Laramie County, it looks like there's two parts of the soil survey, eastern part of the county and the western part. The western part was published in 2001. I'm still looking for a date on the eastern part. I think it's probably a little bit older than that.
Okay.
So fairly modern.
Fairly modern. And how long does it take for good soil to build? Get where it's at. Or develop. Thousands of years, right? It takes a long time. Okay. So they're not going to change a ton. Honestly, things change way more fast with us digging things up and putting it back within 200 times. So one of the things that's really important is getting your soil tested. So we should pass this around. We're going to look at a test. You've been looking at all
I
that.
have it.
So that came out of a garden bed at my house. And I kind of suspected this is what was going to happen. So we can send our soils off to get tested to a lot of different places. I recommend either Ward Labs, WARD out of Kearney, Nebraska, or Colorado State University. They have their soil testing lab. But they're really great because they can give you lots of good information. I like the CSU one because they give you lots of detailed information. So I think everybody got one of these, right? Okay, so this is really nice. One, because I really should have looked ahead of time before I hand textured something to see what the texture was, but they said it's a sandy loam too. You guys should get lucky every now and then. The blind squirrel finds it up. Okay, so these are really nice because this gives you an idea of what's going on. So if that soil's going around, would you think it has that nice dark texture? Do you think you need to add anything to it? Normally you'd say no, right? Well, go down to nitrates, right? I need to add some stuff, right? Okay. The other thing that's nice is it gives me a pH. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit more about why pH is important here in a minute, but that's something else that can really dictate whether or not something does well in our garden or our landscape, and if it does not. So I really enjoy when they tell you you're low on something, what you need to add and put back in. Okay. So you can see that the organic matter on this one is 7.3, but I've been putting lots of heavy feeder vegetables in that garden bed, right? So things that like lots of nutrients. So they're going to deplete those nutrients really fast. So you can see that I need to add nitrogen back into that soil. Would I know that without doing a test? I might visually be able to see from some of my plants that I need to add something right. But really, I'm gonna have a hard time saying yes or no. So that's really cool. It goes through all the other things. Remind me what Catherine talked about last time. She talked a little bit about nutrients, right? Okay, so what ones did she talk about? NPK, okay. So phosphorus. So sometimes we may have a lot of phosphorus, but sometimes that might be limited because of the pH, right? So that's important to know as well. Okay. You can do this on a landscape, or you can do it for a vegetable garden. I like CSU because you can tell if it's for a vegetable garden and they'll know what to do as far as recommendations. So that's really cool.
Where did you get all the aggregates in your soil?
They were there, yeah. I don't know. It was there when I bought the place, so. I'm gonna let Caitlin talk to us about how to take a soil
If you're
test.
trying to lose belly fat, stop doing that.
At least they got that
Word, right? Well,
Sorry.
The most common question that we receive in our extension offices across the state of Wyoming is what type and how much fertilizer should I put on my garden and landscapes? It's a question that I particularly hate because I always like to be right. Without a soil test, I really can't answer that question. In this 20-foot raised bed, I've already taken 2 samples and I'm going to take a third. Put it in a bucket. I'll then take that bucket and I'll mix it up really well. I, of course, have sampled the top 4 to 6 inches. I want to dry the soil out. Wet soil doesn't travel well through the mail. I'll then take a quart bag, put my sample in it. I don't want any plant material, organic material. I really just need the soil. We'll then put that sample in the mail and send it off to the lab. If you need any help with soil sampling techniques or where to send your soil, contact your local extension office. There's a really great scene in the movie Men in Black where Tommy Lee Jones has a little spoon tool and he picks up some soil and hits a button and it tells him everything you want to know about the soil. I've always wanted one of those. Until I can find a store that has one. The way I get the information that my soil has, what my plant needs are, is to send it off to the lab and get that information back.
All right, that's enough of Hudson. And he's not shy about how he feels about things, is he? Even on camera. Okay, so it's a really good way to do stuff. I would suggest if you have multiple garden beds, do separate samples for each of those. If you're like me, I know I should rotate, but do I always do it? No, because this spot is usually better suited for some of my bigger crops. So I don't rotate things as much as I should. So if you have spots like that in your lawn, a test is really important to see where you're at, to kind of get things figured out.
You recommend rotating every year if you can?
Yes. And don't come back for another 3 to 5 years if you can. On barnyards and backyards, if you totally have fallen asleep, think I'm filling you full of it, then you can come read from somebody else. Caitlin is a colleague of ours. She has some nice articles that are on here about managing soils, taking care of soils, all those sorts of things. So those are on barnyards and backyards. Again, same sort of things. Thinking about compost issues or ways to try and compost. Caitlin's done all sorts of things. Maybe I shouldn't even mention it, but I will. She's even I believe, worked with human manure before. So I'll let you think about what that is. I'm not going to explain. So, but she's really great with composting. So other questions like that, we're always available for those things. Again, we're going to hit on it again, binds things together, nutrients for everything to feed on, feeds the entire food chain, right? All the way up, starts with organic matter. Okay, so lots of times that organic matter comes from the waste from plants, right? So that's really important. What do a good chunk of plants, do you know this, have to rely on fungi and bacteria to make things happen? Do you have any idea? Called mycorrhizae. You know what percent of plants in the world need to use that? Almost all, about 80–85% of them. So there's a lot of symbiotic relationships that happen with plant roots and all these different little guys and gals that are in there. Basically what happens is they bind to the roots to make bigger surface area for those roots to absorb more nutrients and water. And then they feed off of some carbohydrates from the roots. So lots of times for them to be happy, we need to have lots of good organic matter for both plants and those mycorrhizae. But if we don't, lots of times we just have a break in the chain essentially. So those things are important. We can also have lots of things that affect the living things as far as moisture, temperature, pH, right? Contaminants, other things that might be going on. So we want to keep all the living things healthy as well. We've kind of been talking a lot about the physical side, the chemistry side a little bit, but we want to think about the living part of soils as well. You know, I really don't know the statistics on it, but I know they found various antibiotics through looking at soil, I believe. So there's lots of different things that the soil can provide. Earthworms are really important as well. So, you know, you see those in your soil, hey, that's a good thing, keep them around. They can ingest 2 to 30 times their weight in soil every day. Okay, stuff that comes out, the casts, they're rich in nutrients. They can even help break up soils that are compacted a little bit. So they do an awesome job with that. So if you see lots of earthworms, be happy, keep them happy. Okay, roots can be a little bit different too. So mycorrhizae help with these plants, so we want to keep them healthy as possible. They absorb mobile and immobile nutrients, so that's important to remember as well. Sometimes we might end up with, you know, plants actually bringing up nasty chemicals out of the ground, right? So where I live in Laramie, there's an old tie plant where they built or made ties for the railroad, right? And there's a nice walkway. Everybody goes and walks their dog, and now there's all these big, beautiful trees, and everybody goes, "Oh, look at these big, beautiful trees." Would you want to really handle too much of those big, beautiful trees? No? No. Anybody know why all those big, beautiful trees are now along the green pathway around there?
They pull the nasty out of the soil.
They pull the nasty out, right? So when they reach maturity, they'll be cut, shipped to North Carolina and taken care of there. They'll have creosote and all sorts of other chemicals that have been brought up. So it's important to remember that too as you move into recommendations for what people should put as borders for their vegetable gardens, right? So should you ever recommend railroad ties? Treated wood? No. Okay. So we need to think about that as well. There's lots of free moving things lots of times. Yes, ma'am.
When you're done with your garden, is it better to pull everything out, which destroys the soil, or just cut things off and let the roots stay in the soil?
You want the Kelly Belton answer?
I don't know.
Okay. So you need to remember when you were a little kid, your mom or dad was always telling you to clean up the room, right? You want it to look like when they were telling you to clean up the room. Put it all in the bed, yeah. So she always uses the great example. She grew up outside of Chicago, spent a lot of time on her grandfather's farm. And every fall he would have that thing immaculate. There wouldn't be corn leak anywhere. I mean, that baby looked like it was brand spanking new, just the way we want it to look. And she always uses the example, should not look like the most immaculate and clean house, right? You want that garden bed to look like it's been a 4-year-old's bedroom floor, right? So having stuff that's there to cover it is important. Things will slowly break down over winter a little bit. We might have some earthworm activity, other things like that, that can help break it down. So, you know, if it's a really cold, open winter and not much snow, sometimes not as much activity, but you've got some good snow over your garden, there's usually quite a few things that are still happening. So, yeah.
Your grandpa, did he, go with, planting a cover crop?
I don't know what he did. Yeah, I don't know. I would assume not. So based on,
Should we think of, in our garden for planting cover crop?
yeah, cover crops are great. The challenge, you know, for me in Laramie, I really don't have enough time to grow a cover crop. If you have the availability to grow one, they're great. Again, it's kind of that green manure stuff. If you can grow it and then knock it down and just kind of work it back in. Again, it's not going to be straight organic matter, but it will eventually help break down to get there. Yep. Yep. Okay, pH. pH is really important. If you do not want to do a test to send to somebody, you can buy basically an at-home test that you can do yourself. I got this one out of Foresters or Forestry Supply, something like that. But you can do it like this. You can use pH strips from that you buy at the store for like a hot tub. But these are really great. Does somebody have a dry soil they want to put in this? Not everybody jump at once. Tell you what, why don't I use this red one I have here? We'll see how this one does. Not everyone jump at once. So, while I'm getting this ready, I'll kind of keep yapping. So, so where do you think we are for most of what we need for, or where are most of our pHs? Anybody have an idea? We're high. Okay. What number do you think? 7.5, 7.5. A lot of where I'm at, we're close to 8, 8.5. Okay. A lot of things start to happen the higher up we go. So, all right. So I think we're about there. So we're going to put in this red one. It's been a while since I've done this, but we'll add a little bit of soil in there. So yeah, it's one of those things. We don't always know we have to test it, so it's really important to have a good idea of what that is. One of the other major things I run into constantly every summer is issues with pH. Okay, so even if you are just a little bit above 7, you can still have a few things that happen. Okay, so what's going on with that cucumber on the left? What's going on? It's a pear. It looks more like a lemon than a cucumber. Well, that's what's happening on the right. So you're close. So what do you think? Is it just something that's weird with, I don't know. Bad soil. Bad soil? Okay. You're closer because lots of people say, oh, there's something, you know, you got a bad batch of seeds. That's nitrogen deficiency, okay? Didn't have enough nitrogen to actually grow properly, okay? Okay. So this is a really important chart. Okay, so as we look, there's various colors, right? So 7 is neutral. We're at 7. We're doing great. We have most of the nutrients probably available based on pH, right? It may or may not be there, but hopefully if they are there, the pH is not limiting what can actually be absorbed by those plants. Okay, so I live in an area where we have 8 to 8.5 soils fairly frequently. So what am I generally worried about? Iron. So I end up with plants all the time, and I can just tell over the phone what's going on, right? But I have dark green veins, and then I have lighter material, right? The tissue in between the veins, which is usually a sign of iron deficiency. Okay, there can be lots of other things that happen, but it's all going to look a little bit different. So these things are really important to catch. It does, if it gets bad enough, like on these leaves where they're starting to burn around the edges, we're definitely starting to see a decrease in the yield, right? So we want to make sure that we don't have really bad issues with that going on. Okay. If we were to go do a soils test, lots of times we're usually great on phosphorus, especially in like a native soil situation. Why do I end up with phosphorus issues? People are having to supplement cattle with phosphorus. There's plenty of phosphorus in the soil, right? What's the issue? Not available, right? So we get to that pH, it's not available. We can have other things like calcium that tend to bind that up as well a little bit. And so then we don't have it available to those plants to absorb, and therefore we end up with a lot of phosphorus issues other places. So iron is a big one. You might have boron. My parents live in Lander. They've got some great apple trees. The one apple tree just looks like, I don't know, scrappy, I guess, for lack of better terms. Got dinky little leaves, the apples form, they look like something like they've been beat up or something like that. What's going on? It's a boron deficiency. Okay, so a lot of these things can show up, even though some of these other things are not showing up as well. So there is some iron chlorosis going on, but the boron deficiency is the main thing that's going on. Okay. There's a couple good resources that are out there. This is a really cool one from Arizona, where you can kind of go through here, look at macro and micronutrients, look at how the leaves look. It'll kind of point you in the right direction of what you might be dealing with. So this is really nice. Another one from Montana State. They have different articles that are on here, but again, it goes through the same sorts of things as far as what's it look like, what's going on. I don't think they have any good apple trees on there, for example, but you know, corn is a really great example. It's been used in a lot of different studies for how those leaves look. Are they purple around the edges, different things like that. Corn is a really good indicator of what you might be deficient in. And lots of times it'll be tied back to that pH. So, we'll keep going here. Let's see, where did we come out? So this is that red one. I'm definitely probably closer to that 8, which would make sense. So on that, which is just soil that is all around Laramie, I tend to have all sorts of issues with iron chlorosis throughout the summer. So that's one of those things. If you want, I can pass this test around. I'll probably just leave this tube up here, but you can see what this is. It's pretty simple and cheap. If you're interested, I'll leave the box. I can order in one, but there's all sorts of those things that are out there. So they have other sensors that are available where you don't even have to do that. You can basically just mix up some soil with water and then test it out. So if you're can, try to use distilled water. Hopefully it has a neutral pH. But otherwise, some of our other water may have a fairly high pH and throw that off. So yeah. Saline and sodic soils. This can kind of get a little bit confusing. How are we doing on needing a break? Do we need a 5-10 minute break before I continue, or are we hanging in there? No, you're right. Okay, get this over with, start late, end early. All right. Okay. So there's this, on page 2, there's this chart. It's a little hard to read. This is in the handout called Garden Soil Health Handbook. It's from Jay Norton. This is off of his website. He has a lot of great information. So if you have further questions, you can take a look at this. But lots of times we hear the words saline and sodic soils. And what I want you to look at is basically this important thing that he has here in this paragraph. We want an electrical conductivity below 4. So we're not going to go through what all that means. But basically what we have is with our soils, we can have a lot of calcium, we can have a lot of sodium and other things that build up. And those all affect whether it's a saline or a sodic soil. But the big thing is we like a test that we can do at CSU or Ward Lab. So we know if we have a salt issue, okay? So that's really important. Because if we have one of those, then we probably need to think about maybe what plants can tolerate that soil better than others. If we have that issue in the garden, Jay has a table in here. Maybe we think about some different crops that help figure out to adapt to that. But what we have is basically we have sodic soils. So I see these around Laramie and some of those really like low-lying areas. We'll have a really high pH and they have a ton of sodium in the soil. Okay, so a lot of salt. And there's so much lots of times that it actually kind of breaks down how those particles hold together. Then there's the other issues of like with saline soils, right? We just have a lot of nutrients that are there, but it just disrupts how plants can absorb water. So we have to end up finding plants that can tolerate it. So we have these types of plants like halophytes and other things. You know, you see them around the edges of a pond where there's lots of salt and other things, right? So those are those kind of plants that can tolerate that. So again, point to this is we want to be below that 8.5 pH. We want to make sure if you get a test, it's below 4 on that electrical conductivity. If we're above that, then we probably have some other issues we need to figure out. So that is the point to all of that.
All these problems that you're showing with the soil, if you do a garden without hail screen, in Laramie,
I do. Without hail screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm kind of a gambler, so I know I'm gonna get a hailstorm about once every 3 or 4 years. That's bad enough. I need to
oh
worry about it.
Lord, we got 4 of them in a row here the other year.
Oh, geez. Yeah, I like to grow in low tunnels, so I can cover them up really quick too. But my strawberries are exposed, so I have to make sure I'm home so I can throw stuff over it. But yes, if you're a gambler, go without. If not, screen is good. Okay, so pH is really tough to modify. Okay, so they've tried to do this on lots of like mineland reclamation, go out and change the pH. They can get it changed, and then you have to go back 5 years, 6 years down the road and do the same thing again. So it gets really tough from that aspect to change the pH of your soil. Again, organic matter helps, but I have people say, well, can I just add pine needles because they're slightly acidic? Sure, it's probably not going to fix the problem, but you can try. So, you know, in a garden setting, we might be able to fix it, but in a landscape situation, that's going to be a lot of time, a lot of effort. So that's pretty challenging. Okay, So lots of times we can get sources of salt as the parent material. I gave the example about Laramie, how it comes up through the parent material when they flood irrigate. About salty water. Yes. I have been to several houses in Laramie where things were fine, and then 6, 7 years down the road, things were not okay. They didn't test their water before they started watering plants in the landscape. Okay, things were permanently changed after that. So if you are moving to a property, you're going to advise someone that's moving to a property. They don't know what their test is for their well. Have them do it to make sure it's okay. I always used to say this, and then it was like 2 or 3 right in a row where that was the issue. So they just hadn't checked it, and then we looked at the water report, water test they got back, and that's definitely what was going on. So one of those things to think about. Yeah, I mean, you just know, you try to figure out something that can go there. I mean, really the best thing to work away salts is to try and leach them through the soil profile. It takes a ton of water. And if you're in somewhere like Laramie where, you know, there's already a lot of those salts farther down, sometimes you just make it worse by trying to do that. So, so yeah, if you can start out with something good, that's important. Manure applications, high and salt, right? Yes. Everybody's nodding with me. Yes. Okay. Fertilizer applications, high and salt, right? Yes. It is a salt that we're putting down. Okay. So if you have a high electrical conductivity test, should you apply lots of manure and fertilizer? No. Yes, sir.
Oh, I was gonna say, Kathleen just won't tolerate horse manure.
She probably has good reasons for that. I won't get on that bandwagon with her to save you, but if she's already given you her opinion, I concur with her. So, but you know, these are the things to think about. You know, as master gardeners, you may go to houses and somebody's dumped a lot of manure around the spot, right? So be thinking about what she's told you with the manure applications. Think about the salts. I've also, on a side note, I'm not going to get down the rabbit hole too far, but I've had issues with, you know, herbicide residual that's left over in manure. People will not believe me on it. I bet I've had probably a dozen cases. Several of them have been people that grew in greenhouses for the catering business. Just really would not believe me that that was the issue. Finally, they switched up the manure they were using and the problem fixed. But those are some things to really think about. So Catherine's here. We won't talk anymore about manure. So she has to start waving.
May I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Would you define parent material? That's a new term for me, and I'm not sure I really understand what it is.
Yeah, so parent material was like those boulders and rocks that we looked at,
Okay.
some of those first things. So it's what you start out with. Yep.
Okay. Is it always rock though?
It's not always rock.
Okay.
Most of the time it is probably bedrock. But sometimes it might be large, you know, cobbles and other things, gravels that are kind of compacted.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, good question. Yes, ma'am.
If you go out to a home where they use railroad ties, what do you recommend? Like food conservation?
I would recommend they plant flowers there, and probably not stuff they're going to.
Just move over.
Absolutely, yep, yep. Good question. Well, that's just me. Okay. We can have animals leave our organic matter behind, but if we just use straight manure, is that organic matter? No, that's kind of on that nutrient side, right? So lots of times you were also going to run into this issue of finding people when you go to do a house call that think they've dumped a bunch of manure somewhere and that's their organic matter, right? So keep that in mind. It's not composted all the way, all those sorts of things. Grass clippings, we'll go ahead and watch this one. We'll see who we get on this one. Well, this one doesn't.
Hey, I'm not gonna look, I want you to see my time.
It's like $500.
500 bucks?
Yeah, but you'll get back one for what, for downside things like.
Now that we're into the heat of summer, it's a really good time to make sure that you have some mulch on all of your garden spaces. And lawn clippings are a really good way to use up a resource that we have in our yards already, and it's inexpensive to use in our gardens. As you're mowing the lawn, you can bring bags of lawn clippings and dump it on your grass. And then once you finish the lawn mowing project, come back to the gardens and spread that mulch across the various gardens. One of the things that you want to consider when you're using lawn clippings, that if you use a weed killer or something like weed and feed on your lawn, you want to check the label on the product that you use. The active ingredient in those chemicals won't discriminate between weeds and the plants that we want in our gardens, and it can kill anything that's a broadleaf plant. So you'd want to wait at least a few mowings, but follow the label instructions on how long you have to wait before the grass is safe to use in your gardens. When you're putting the lawn clippings on the garden, you can just dump them all in one place. But then, once you get down to putting the mulch around each individual plant, you want to make sure that you don't get more than about a 2-inch layer around the plants. You want to make sure that you keep the mulch away from the crown of your plants or about 2 inches away from the trunks of trees and shrubs. For the University of Wyoming Extension, this has been Donna Quinn from the.
Okay, so that probably will come up as well. Grass clippings are great for decreasing the amount of water you need to use, keeping out weeds, other things like that. But again, it goes back to that rabbit hole I was going down with as far as pesticides and manure. You can also have it in grass clippings, right? So keep that in mind. I don't know, do they test your city compost, Catherine, for those sorts of things? I know in Laramie they don't, it's just,
They're supposed to
You can.
test for at least pick one.
okay.
And the wild stuff isn't used.
Okay.
And
Okay, gotcha. Right, exactly. So, so that is one of those things, if somebody's tested it, you're okay, but otherwise you're probably not okay. Okay, you normally end at 9. I wait.
no, you can.
Oh, you go. Okay. I don't want to be too late. You're flexible. Okay, so we're gonna watch Hudson again, the guy with wasn't afraid to share his opinion. He's gonna talk to us a little about composting. And then from there, I've got a handout. We're gonna talk about that. And then we should be pretty well wrapped up. So sound cool? Hanging in there? All right. Only had 10 fall asleep so far, Kathy. Great. I'm feeling great.
Meet your next pillow. Why do we make our pillow in the shape of a
Most
cube?
entertaining
I'll
part.
tell you.
I'm really glad I didn't get this going ahead.
Spring is a great time of year for those people who've had compost piles to get their compost pile started. It's also a great time of year for those wanting compost piles to start it. This episode, we're going to talk about the ingredients that need to go into a compost pile. It's really simple. We break the ingredients that go into a compost pile in 2 areas, green and brown. Green's nitrogen and brown's carbon. So what we have here, of course, is a pile that's mostly brown, carbon. So we have some high quality chicken manure that we're going to add to it. And in general, we want to add 1 part green, 1 part nitrogen, to 30 parts carbon. It's really important that we stir that in good. As things green up, and we start mowing our lawns, gathering leaves, pulling weeds out of the garden, we can add that green to this pile as we go. There's a great publication on the University of Wyoming Extension website called Backyard Composting that you can find. Composting is a great way to get rid of unwanted organic matter that we can then add back to our gardens as needed fertilizer. Tune in next week, and we'll talk about the management strategies that we'll employ in the compost pile.
Okay, so you all have that. I'm gonna watch the second part.
So last time I was talking about the ingredients that you can start a compost pile with in the spring. Now I want to talk really about how we manage the compost pile. When I teach people about a compost pile, I really want to talk to them about the fact that they now have millions of pets that we call microbes. So last week we talked about how to feed them. Now today we really want to talk about how to take care of them. The first thing we do with a pet is give it exercise. And that's what we do by stirring the pile. The kind of microbes that we want living in this pile are aerobic, oxygen-loving microbes. Things like putting lateral stuff in there, burying it up, might help oxygen come in. I've even seen people drill holes in PVC and put that down into the pile to help oxygen go down into the pile. But most important, we really probably need to stir that pile at least once a week. Anybody that's composted in Wyoming knows that our cold winters usually shut our piles off. They stop those microbes from working. But in the summertime, they stop because they get too dry. We've got to keep these microbes in an environment where they can live. We've got to keep our compost pile moist. We're probably going to have to water at least once a week in the summertime. The rule of thumb that I like to go by is when we pick that compost up, we want it to feel icky enough that we want to put it down, but then it doesn't stick to our hands. Kind of like a wet sponge. Again, there's a great publication on UW Extension's website called Backyard Composting. This is
Thinking a scientific word or?
It's like having a, garden that looks like a porter would pick up your floor. Okay, here's one other option when it comes to composting. This might be more achievable for some of us than large scale.
composting in Wyoming is sometimes rather difficult. One alternative to composting outside is vermicomposting. Vermicomposting is actually using worms to make compost. The worms that we use are actually called red wigglers. They're a little smaller than night crawlers, and we can keep them basically in the house. When we're keeping worms, we really want to think of them as pets. We basically have to keep them fed and watered and exercised, moving from one bin to the other. Here in this bin, we have a bin that the worms are basically moved out of because there's nothing else to eat. And boy, isn't that a beautiful material to use as potting soil as a soil amendment anywhere in our yard. The top one has mostly the undigested material. Where the worms are, we can see a piece of turnip, an apple slice that's been added to this compost bin. Basically, we want to use plant material along with some kind of base like shredded newspaper or cardboard or peat moss. Some concerns, if there's any smell coming from an indoor worm bin, you're probably keeping it too wet. Here, these worms are turning something that would normally end up in the landfill into something great that we can use as a soil amendment anywhere in our yards. This is Hudson Hill,
Okay, so there they are. So what do you think?
Why red wigglers instead of night crawlers?
Red wigglers tend to do a better job of composting than a lot of the different things, from what I understand.
Where do you buy one?
Well, you buy them, what's their name?
Liz Meyer.
Erica Babbitt. What's the name of it? The Worm Wrangler or something? The Worm Wrangler. Erica Babbitt, the Worm Wrangler. Okay, so I have, one former colleague that used to keep them under the kitchen sink, one current colleague that keeps them in the basement, and throw scraps in there and get all sorts of good organic matter. So those are things that are out there. So you don't want to do that, that's fine. So let's look at our handout, the backyard composting. We are going to talk about what I don't do right in Laramie.
What page are
Let's see, where should I start? Let's start on page 2. And we're going to go to number 3. Okay, so number 2, I do a nice job of keeping it in the sun. It's protected by some fences, so I get lots of good south facing sun, so that's good. We go on to page number 3, wind. Yeah, it's kind of kept out of the wind, but not really, right? I talked about the big bins that you can spin. Those keep the water in there a lot better than in Laramie, right? We know how fast it dries out. Water, how often do I water? Once a month, maybe, if I think of it. So not enough. Remember, this is what I can draw, right? So I never water it enough, okay? I just have a really hard time spending the money on water in Laramie for what they charge for my compost. I'd rather go buy the compost. It's gonna be cheaper in the long run. So, but if you have water and you can do it, think about it. So that's where one of those bins or something that's a little more protected would be better if I'm gonna spend the money on that water. Okay. Appearance. Mine looks bad. I'm not sure why I have that pile in my backyard, but it's there, right? So that's another thing to think about, okay? Sometimes it's kind of unsightly. We spend all this time, money, energy, water to get our yards looking right, and then we have kind of a nasty looking compost in the back. So think about that. Some other problems. Pile is too wet. Usually that's not a huge issue for us. Pile is too dry. That tends to be one of our major issues. I never work the pile. It doesn't get good aeration. Sometimes I'll throw some branches in and then other stuff. But lots of times I really just don't end up with, properly working it, keeping those microbes happy. All the things Hudson talked about, I'm not doing correctly. So we keep going. There's not an offensive odor. Luckily, because I probably don't keep it watered enough, but 2, I don't end up taking a lot of my lawn clippings and throwing them on there. So there's lots of piles that you go to that just stink, right? Okay, so that can be another thing. Cold weather composting, right? It gets really tough. In a cold environment, you have to have a really big pile of stuff to make it happen. Okay, in Canada, they've been doing some really cool stuff of actually on-farm things, composting animals, but these are huge piles, right? This isn't just something that happens in the backyard. So if you're in a cold environment, you have to think about, you need a larger area for some of these things, which can take up a lot of, valuable space. Okay. Again, the uses, hopefully if I get those, I can throw them back in the garden. Worms is another option. Does anybody currently use compost worms? After that lovely video, who's gonna do it? All right, there we go. Great man in the back, I like it. So it is an option. To be honest, Caitlin, our colleague who has a tray just like what he showed, she's brought it out and done stuff with kids. It doesn't smell. It's not huge. The thing is making sure that it's in a warm spot. It can't freeze, right? So it does have to be in your house. But it is pretty amazing, the compost that comes out of it. The kids, when she's done stuff with kids, they actually really like it. Kept going back to it later in the day to see if they'd eat more of the scraps they throw in and stuff. So it is kind of cool from that aspect. So I guess my advice is if you're thinking about composting, make sure it doesn't have any of these pesticides in it. 2, think about if it's going to be outside that you've got enough space, you can keep it well watered. If you can't, then think about one of those bins that you can turn or something else that keeps it contained. And then 4, if you don't need a ton or you actually want to succeed, you may have to think about the worm wrangler red wigglers. So yeah, those are some options that are there. So, okay, we just have a few other follow-up things. Is there any questions on composting? I am not probably the compost expert like some folks, but it's definitely needed. And growing up, my uncle had one of the bins you could turn, and that worked really well compared to just throwing stuff haphazardly in the backyard. So I guess my advice is if you're going to do it, go all the way. and you'll have success that way. So. You have this pump, so I won't go over that. Okay, so soil erosion is one thing I want to talk about, just to hit on right at the very end, right? So here we have a freshly plowed field for planting some new types of grass. So what are some things that happened as soon as he plowed this up? Okay, we have potential for wind erosion. What else happened to that soil though? Loss of nitrogen, loss of carbon. What else happened? Yeah, messed up the worms. They're not happy now. We kind of beat up all those nice structured pieces that we have, right? All those aggregates. Okay, we beat up some of those. Okay. So that's what happened. We have the potential to put something nice in there and really not do a whole lot of damage, right? But you know, what happens at a large scale can also be on a small scale in our backyard. And I like this photo because something this scale takes a lot more time and effort. For us in our backyard garden, does it take very much time and effort compared to this? Not really, right? We can just go out there real quickly, kind of add a lot of disturbance real quickly without thinking about it. So, so that's important. Again, one thing that's nice about this is it kind of is more of that messy bed look, right? We've got some excess plant material that's there to hopefully protect it. It will break down eventually to add back to the soil. As we talked about again in the beginning, thinking about steepness of slope, our soil texture, what's our climate look like, those are all going to affect erosion, right? So where I live in Laramie, wind is always a constant, right? Same with you here in Cheyenne. So those things, if things aren't protected, we're going to have some issues. The other part with that is when we get rain, I don't know if this is the same here, but do we ever get those nice drizzly rains that just like dump an inch of water? No, it's like a quarter inch in like 2 seconds, it seems like, right out of a thunderstorm. So protecting those soils is really important as well. So thinking about a mulch is really important. We have lots of good information on different types of mulch. One of the things I've been working on in Laramie is experimenting with different types of mulch, the ones that hold up the best to wind, but then also the ones that can prevent weeds. So are you familiar with the type of mulch called gorilla hair? That's how I purchased it, and it's very fine. So it was interesting, that one held up the best in the wind, but it failed the worst on weed control. Basically what we figured out was all the weed seeds blew in on top, and you could barely even see that there was any mulch down below. So we did this for 2 years at the experiment stations in Laramie. The next big one that worked were the big chunks that you could buy. So that one was great. And then the one that kind of did the best out of everything was the cheapest mulch you could find. It was the city mulch. It's the stuff from all the branches that they clean up around town. It really didn't blow away too far, and it did a really good job of suppressing weeds. So, which is kind of interesting to think. Never thought that's what I'd be experimenting with, but it's been very useful for recommendations to people. So the finer chips blew a lot further, and definitely weren't as great for weed control. Weeds were able to operate. So, yes, sir.
How do you buy that from the city? I mean, do they have it bagged, or do you show up with gardening? How do you?
I don't know how you buy it from the city. I think eventually they do, but the point with that is,
Okay.
I went there with a truck and they had unfortunately my truck was really small bed. They just came up with a big dump and just dumped it. Said, have fun, that was $5.
okay.
Put a tarp in your truck.
We can't buy it in Laramie, so the point with that is the city wanted to know what they should do with all their mulch, so they had to get used. What's up? I haven't seen it there, so I don't know that they still have it anymore. So they used to, but I don't know that they still do. But yeah, so so mulch is really important with all this stuff. You know, if you have a sandy soil, right, helping make sure you're not losing a lot of water. is important.
Oh,
Oh, who am I
I just had
missing?
a quick
Oh,
question.
sorry, yep.
When I compost or not, when I put my stuff in the bin, I have cheatgrass seeds in there. So what happens to that when it goes into the city mulch? Do the
Well-
cheatgrass seeds, because I get rid of those.
Yeah, so hopefully they're heating it hot enough,
Okay,
composting it all the way that those die.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So hopefully, that's another challenge too, is if you're in a cold climate, get that hot enough. I don't get hot enough in my backyard really to compose stuff, or even get it to that point to kill everything. So we want to avoid, animal byproducts and different things like that in the compost as well. Yeah. Okay, again, for erosion, you know, if you go to make a house call, people are dealing with this issue, just have them try to work those high risk areas first. I don't know about you, Catherine, but I end up feel like I go to, hey, will you come check out my trees or my garden that doesn't look great? And then it's like, I've got this huge expanse that's like been disturbed because it's a new house or something like that. There's cool things that are out there like coconut matting that's made out of coconut material, so you don't have to worry about invasive plants. There's lots of different things that are out there. So we can chat more if you ever have questions, or Catherine's a good resource. We won't go down that road tonight, but I would start with that, and then just really thinking about you know, what's going to be the most important for folks to go with. So other resources, this top one is that handout you have from Jay. So he has gardening help. He has a lot of other things that are out there, but this is a really cool resource. So you can click on the gardening help handbook. It's what you have tonight. Pictures aren't really that much more clear, but again, we have the charts. He has some more information again about that field test for how much water we have in our soil. Then, if I can find it, he has a really good one. Salt tolerance for vegetables and woody fruit crops. So that might be of interest to some of you if you have that. So otherwise, the web soil survey we talked about, your extension office, who you know, barnyardsandbackyards.com, and then conservation district and NRCS offices are also good information too. Okay, that's all I have. Any other questions? Anything else? Okay.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, well, thanks. And Wednesday night,
Yeah.
hopefully this, we don't get so much snow that we can't show up, but we'll still try to be here. Yeah, David.
Last week, we talked about the green house or something that was up at Laramie at the university. What's going on?
Yeah, there's a green roof, it's called a green roof. It's at the Biodiversity Center. And that's
Did we go there anytime?
oh yeah, that's a worthwhile field trip for sure. Sometime in late May or early June, we should all drive over there and take a look at it. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you figure what you got, your background being playing in the dirt all the time. It's like, yeah, really. Oh, yeah. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. Oh, sure. Anytime. Oh, really? Good night.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Glad I can coordinate myself. Thank you.